There was a black sheep in the prestigious Rothstaler family, a student notorious for making trouble at Silvenia Academy. His name? Ed Rothstaler. Thanks to his awful behaviour, his family had finally had enough. They disowned him, cutting him off from both status and fortune. Now broke, unwanted, and with nowhere to stay, Ed was being kicked out of his dorm. The other students didn't even try to hide how eager they were to see him gone. They watched from a distance, whispering behind his back. Good riddance, they thought. School would be quieter without him. But the truth was, none of this was actually his fault, because the Ed Rothstaler they all remembered, the arrogant noble who made everyone's life miserable, wasn't really him. He had been transported into a game. Silvenia's failed swordmaster, a fantasy RPG he used to love. Normally, people summoned into another world end up with cheat skills or overpowered stats. They become the protagonist, or at least someone rich and important. But him? He woke up as a third-rate villain who barely even shows up in the story. A character who gets kicked out in the prologue. Honestly, this had to be the worst possible start. Sitting with his bags beside him, Ed clenched his fists. This was completely unfair. Why did he have to become this guy? Nearby students overheard and scoffed. They couldn't believe someone like him was complaining. He sat back down, defeated. Silvenia Academy sat on a vast island called Arcana Island. Dense forests stretched across much of the land, quiet and secluded. Ed had been walking for half a day now, heading northeast, anywhere to get away from the glares and whispers of the other students. Eventually, he sat down on his luggage in the middle of the woods. If Ed had just been disowned, that meant the game's story had only just begun. Luckily, he hadn't been expelled from the academy itself, which meant there was still a chance. If he could just survive long enough to graduate, he might be able to avoid the fate this character was destined for. Silvenia Academy was one of the most prestigious schools in the continent. Graduating guaranteed a future filled with wealth, influence, and recognition. And since the game took place at the academy, he knew the storyline inside out. That knowledge was now his biggest weapon. His first goal was simple: survive and graduate. The only problem: the tuition. This semester was already paid for, but after that, he'd need a scholarship. Sitting on a rock under the trees, he pulled up his stat screen. A glowing projection hovered in front of him. The numbers were awful. Low in every category, not that it was surprising. Ed Rothstaler barely had a role in the original game. Even he could barely remember the guy. He thought back to the ending credits after finishing the game. It had said Ed ended up as a beggar on the streets. Ed sighed. Of all the characters to end up as, why this one? For now, the tuition could wait. His most immediate problem was survival. He needed shelter, food, and something to wear. He opened the 2 luggage bags he'd been dragging through the woods. Inside? A few flashy outfits, completely impractical, no stat boosts. An ornamental dagger, looked expensive but useless in combat. And a decorative goblet, again, no stats. Well, at least he had clothing. That was one problem solved. Next step, find shelter. Then figure out food. Getting a part-time job was out of the question. His reputation was in the gutter, and there was no way he'd be allowed back in the dorms. It looked like he'd be living in the forest for a while. Luckily, there was a small stream nearby. That would help. The new semester started in 10 days. That gave him just over a week to build something that could keep him dry and warm. Standing up, Ed stretched his arms. No use complaining. He had to get started. He used a wind-based spell to begin slicing branches. It worked, but after only a few tries, he dropped to the ground completely drained. He hadn't expected magic to be this exhausting. Or maybe he was just that weak. They could have at least given him a meal before kicking him out. His stomach grumbled. Then a strange memory surfaced, something his grandfather once said. Back when food was scarce in early spring, he'd survived by eating tree bark. It was worth a try. Ed filled the goblet with stream water, dropped in a few strips of bark, and tried to heat it with a bit of fire magic. He didn't care what it tasted like. As long as it was edible, it would do. Eventually the bark softened in the hot water. He took a deep breath, told himself it was chicken, and bit into it. He forced a bite, then immediately regretted it as he doubled over, gagging. A couple of days passed. Ed was still gathering wood, but he didn't look so good. His cheeks were hollowing out and his steps were slower. Turns out, bark is not food. After 2 days of throwing up and eating nothing else, that much was clear. He'd never been more tired in his life, and the shelter wasn't exactly coming together on its own. Every task felt like too much for one person, but he kept going. Through sheer stubbornness, he finally managed to tie a basic frame together. He couldn't sleep on bare dirt, so he tossed all his extra clothes onto the ground to make a makeshift bed. The next day, the shelter was finally done. Primitive, sure, but it held together. He dropped to the forest floor and looked up at the result of his suffering, and then, to his surprise, a system notification popped up. His crafting skill had increased. He blinked. So the system really did work like the game. He opened his stats screen and checked the skill list. Handicraft. Level 4. Better than expected. Apparently, Ed Rothstaler was more suited to building things than casting spells. If he was going to survive out here, that skill might just save him. He tied the ornamental dagger to a sturdy branch, fashioning a crude harpoon. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. The hunger was unbearable, and now he had a goal. Fish. He was going to eat fish. Dragging himself to the stream, Ed raised his makeshift weapon. Then, half out of desperation, half out of raw hunger, he shouted into the woods. He wanted real food! Later that day, Ed sat beside a fire he'd made using a bit of magic. His freshly caught fish sizzled over the flames. Real food. Finally. There was only a week left before the semester started. If he could keep this up, just survive a little longer, he'd be fine. He bit into the fish. It was the best thing he'd tasted in his entire life. Then an annoyed voice called out from the trees. What was he still doing here? Ed froze mid-bite and turned his head, startled. He'd been so focused on eating that he hadn't noticed anyone approaching. A girl stood at the edge of the clearing, long blonde hair swaying behind her, arms crossed, brows furrowed. She looked at him like he was some pest that had overstayed his welcome. He recognised her immediately, one of the game's main characters, and the reason he'd been kicked out of the dorm. Princess Penia. Back in the game's story, Ed Rothstaler had been a proper villain, and it wasn't hard to see why someone would want to hit him. He had tried to harass the protagonist's childhood friend. Naturally, the protagonist didn't let that slide and landed a solid punch in return. Ed, being Ed, didn't take it well. Fueled by petty revenge, he tampered with the entrance exams, trying to keep the protagonist from getting into the academy. But he got caught. Princess Penia had witnessed the entire thing. And with her unique ability, insightful eyes, she exposed his plot easily. The skill revealed lies and schemes without fail. Even when Ed swore up and down that he was innocent, the results didn't lie. And now, here they were again. The princess standing in front of him, clearly irritated, demanding to know why he was still here. This was not a good situation. The princess didn't waste time. She asked if he hadn't been expelled. Ed explained calmly that technically he was still a student. It was true that he'd been kicked out of the dorms, but not the academy. That didn't sit well with her. She said someone like him had no place at a school like Silvenia. If necessary, she'd speak to the headmaster herself. As she continued lecturing him, Ed noticed something more important. His food was about to burn. While she kept going on about how disgraceful he was, he quietly shifted tactics. If he wanted her to leave, he needed to change the subject. He walked toward her, speaking in a careful tone. The sun would be setting soon. Should a royal really be wandering alone in the woods at this hour? The princess stiffened at the implication. She asked if he was threatening her, and warned that if he was, he'd regret it. Faint magical energy began to gather around her. Ed quickly knelt on one knee, just as one should before royalty. Smiling, he told her no. In fact, he was incredibly grateful to her. That made her pause. She didn't understand what he meant, so she activated insightful eyes. A moment later, she flinched. There were no lies. He wasn't pretending. Still kneeling, Ed could tell she was surprised. But he wasn't lying. He was grateful. The Rothstaler family had always been powerful, but they were rotten. They'd abused that power, experimented on people, and chased immortality. Their crimes became a major part of the game's story, until the protagonist put an end to them. Every member of the house ended up either dead or imprisoned. But now that Ed was disowned, he could avoid that fate entirely. He might be hungry and homeless, but at least he'd live. All he had to do now was convince the princess that he wouldn't cause any more trouble. If he managed that, maybe he could avoid expulsion too. But one thing didn't make sense. Why was she here, alone in the middle of the forest? Ed stood and looked at her again. If she had no guards and was out here by herself, then there was only one explanation. She was in the middle of the entrance assignment. There was only one assignment this could be. Professor Glass' class exam. A test where students had to search the forest for hidden magical marbles. Simple in theory, but the difficulty came from how well the marbles were hidden. Ed knew the assignment well. He casually mentioned that this one was pretty tough. But of course, someone like her, a princess, would be aiming for Class A. The princess narrowed her eyes. She asked if he was trying to flatter her. It didn't seem like he'd changed at all. She kept talking, but Ed stepped forward before she could finish. Without his help, she wouldn't make it into Class A. He told her to check, use her ability again. If he was lying, she could have him expelled herself. Then he told her where to go. Southeast of the island, in the middle of a lake, there was a large tree known as the Guardian Tree of Merilda. That's where she'd find it, his gift, the golden marble. The princess stood at the base of the Guardian Tree, golden marble in hand. She stared at it in disbelief. Just 3 days ago, Ed Rothstaler had been a liar and a cheat. She could still picture that disgraceful expression. But now, the Ed she had just met felt different. The exam came to a close. Professor Glass stood before the gathered students, hands behind his back. He asked them to present what they had found. Some held out stones. Others offered beads, shiny buttons. One student even brought an egg. Turning around, the professor gave his verdict. They were all in Class F. He then raised his hands and revealed 3 glowing marbles. Golden, faintly radiating mana. These, he explained, were the real objective. Difficult to detect, they gave off just enough magical energy to be found by only the most observant. Only 3 students had succeeded. Ziggs, Lortel, and the one who had discovered the most deeply hidden marble of all, the one placed inside the Guardian Tree of Merilda. Student Penia. She had taken the top spot. Earlier, not long after the princess had left the clearing, Ed sat crouched by his fire. His fish was half burned, but he was too tired to care. He didn't have the strength to hunt again, so he started putting together a crude fishing rod instead. As he tied bait to the hook, he thought about the princess, the 3rd daughter of the Empire. Someone who had sharpened her insightful eyes through years of navigating palace politics, lies, and betrayal. He knew he couldn't have fooled her. If he'd lied, it would have been over for him right there. So instead, he gave her something useful, something that would get her off his back. But that caused its own problem. In the original story, the princess had failed that very exam. She'd been placed in Class F and humbled by the experience. That failure earned her a new reputation on campus, one that would grow stronger over time. She became known as the Princess of Benevolence, a noble who rose above her pride to treat others with fairness and dignity. But that moment, her defeat, was what changed her. Now that story was broken. Still. Ed figured it wasn't the end of the world. He might have nudged things off track, but at least the top student wouldn't change. No matter what he did, that role always belonged to Lucy May Real. The princess wandered the school halls, her thoughts heavier than usual. She still couldn't believe it. Ed had actually helped her find the marble. It didn't sit right. She had kept her identity hidden during the exam. She hadn't wanted to rely on her royal status to influence her grade. The goal had always been to succeed through her own effort. But now, thanks to him, she'd landed in Class A. She thought back to the moment he told her she'd fail without his help. What frustrated her most was that he'd been telling the truth. Her ability had confirmed it. The realization hit her like a weight. She stopped mid-step, clenched her fists, and drove one into the wall beside her. Ed may have helped her this time, but she'd prove him wrong. From now on, everything she achieved would be through her own work. And she'd be keeping a close eye on him. The sun rose over Silvenia Island. Ed forced himself up at dawn. The academy wasn't exactly nearby, and the run through the forest wasn't getting any shorter. Eventually he made it. Silvenia Academy loomed before him, alive with students. He stepped through the gates and paused. For a moment, he just stood there taking it in. He'd made it. Inside the main hall, the opening ceremony was already underway. Decorated tables were spread with food in every direction. A feast to welcome the start of the semester. Ed sat at his assigned spot, ignoring the whispers around him. Some students were shocked, others annoyed. They couldn't believe he had the nerve to show his face. He didn't care. The food was incredible, and if no one was going to stop him from eating, then he'd eat, and keep eating. His table was already covered in empty plates, and he was still going. He wasn't going to waste a single bite. Let them talk. His goal hadn't changed. He was here to survive, and to graduate. As he finished one last bite, a group of girls walked past behind him. One paused for just a moment. She glanced back at him, puzzled. Something about him felt different. Then she turned and walked on. The opening ceremony had officially begun. On his first day, Ed was summoned to the headmaster's office. He wasn't expelled, but the message was clear. He was being watched. One more instant, and he'd be out. From now on, he had to be careful, especially not to stray too far from the original plot. So he did what he could to stay focused. He trained in practical skills, starting with bow proficiency. It wasn't glamorous, but it would help him hunt the smaller game that roamed the forest. One afternoon, his arrow struck true, a clean hit, straight through a rabbit. As he picked up the lifeless animal, something caught his eye. Someone was sitting near the guardian tree. A girl. She sat calmly against the tree trunk, a book open in her lap. Ed recognised her immediately. Yenneka Palerova, top of the second years, a genius elementalist known across the academy. Before he could say anything, she looked up and smiled. Then, in the blink of an eye, she vanished, and reappeared right in front of him, as if she'd teleported straight from the lake. She introduced herself cheerfully, insisting he call her Yenneka. Ed stared. She had moved so fast it didn't make any sense. She noticed his surprise, and explained that she'd heard a lot about him. Apparently, the forest spirits had been talking. The entire forest was under the protection of a high-ranking spirit named Marilda. According to her, Ed was the new unwanted guest causing a stir. Ed broke into a nervous sweat. He hadn't realised he was an unwelcome guest, but thinking back, it made sense. He had been chopping wood and hunting around the forest without a second thought. Still smiling, Yenneka told him not to worry. Hunting was natural. Marilda didn't mind that at all. Ed, remembering that Marilda was supposed to be a spirit wolf, figured it wasn't fair to judge her by appearance, especially since the spirit didn't sound nearly as intimidating as her reputation made her out to be. Yenneka paused, then laughed. Of course, she agreed. Yenneka held out her hands with a beaming smile. She wanted to show him something. She explained that she had just formed a new contract with a spirit, and asked if he wanted to hold it. Ed paused. He knew how this was supposed to go. If he wanted to get close to her, playing along would be the easiest route. But getting close wasn't part of the plan. He lowered his gaze and calmly told her he couldn't see spirits. The cheer drained from her face instantly. Her eyes widened in surprise, and the energy around her quieted. Ed turned away, excusing himself. He still had foraging to do. As he walked, he reminded himself not to stray from the story. He couldn't afford to change anything else, not when Yenneka played such a major role later on. He needed to avoid her entirely. Behind him, Yenneka watched quietly. She thought back to what he'd said, not being able to see spirits. Then she turned to the large wolf standing beside her. She gave Marilda a light pat and told the spirit that maybe Ed really couldn't see them after all. The spirit lay down on the ground with a quiet thump. Yenneka dropped onto the thick fur with a soft grumble, burying her face in frustration. She was just trying to be nice, and he brushed her off like it didn't matter. Still lying there, she muttered that she didn't get him at all. The distance from Ed's camp to the school was far enough that he had to begin running at dawn just to make it in time. Still, he figured the daily sprint through the forest counted as a decent workout. From a shaded tree nearby, a familiar silhouette watched in silence. He studied hard in class, jotting down notes with a makeshift writing tool, a wooden poker, and a slab of stone. Paper and ink were too expensive for someone in his position. Again, someone familiar was watching. After classes, he'd stop by the river to wash his uniform and hope the heat dried it by morning. He couldn't afford a second set. Still, someone was watching. At the end of the day, he checked his supplies, water, food, firewood, making sure he had enough to last through the night. Even then, he could feel someone behind him. He finally turned around and called out, asking how long she planned to keep following him. Yenneka stepped out from behind his makeshift shelter, surprised he'd noticed. Ed told her she wasn't exactly subtle. He asked if she knew who he was. Ed Rothstaler, the one everyone despised. She brushed it off, saying what others thought didn't matter. She hadn't gotten to know him yet. Ed narrowed his eyes. This was just like her. She always looked like her head was in the clouds, but she didn't waver once she made up her mind. Still, he reminded himself of the truth. Yenneka Palarova was the final boss of Act 1. Ed closed his eyes. She was the only person who'd shown him even a little kindness since he arrived. But if he wanted to stay off the story's radar, he had to push her away. That meant playing the part everyone expected. The villain. When he opened his eyes again, he turned to her and asked for a favour. She immediately lit up, her voice full of enthusiasm. He gestured around him. Anyone could see his situation. He was broke. Being disowned had ruined him completely. So he asked her, could she lend him some money? Her expression froze. The excitement drained from her face in an instant. Ed already knew. She wasn't from a rich, noble house. She might have been the top student, but that was because she earned a scholarship. A girl from the countryside, daughter of a humble farmer, her greatest weakness was money. Yenneka stood there, visibly struggling. She didn't want to say no, but she couldn't say yes either. After a long, painful pause, she apologised. She had no money. Her voice was quiet, like something inside her had just died. Ed was on his usual hunt, making his way back to camp with dinner in hand. He still felt a little bad about how he'd treated Yenneka, but it had to be done. Keeping his distance was the only way to avoid the story spiralling further off course. He reached his shelter, ready to store his supplies, only to stop short at the sight of someone already there. Someone was sleeping in his bed. His eyes widened. Of all people, why was she here? He had been doing everything he could to avoid the main characters, yet now the most powerful student in the entire academy was napping in his shelter. Lucy May Reel. She sat up, stretched, and yawned without a care in the world. Ed just stared, still trying to process what was happening. Then she groaned, rubbing her eyes, and muttered that something was being too noisy. Still half asleep, she pointed behind him and complained that the huge wolf nearby wouldn't stop talking. It kept asking him to save Yenneka from her miserable fate. He couldn't see the wolf, but the thing that was bothering him was that Lucy May Reel was here. and she was telling him the spirit guardian was asking him to save another major character, Yenneka. He thought he could escape all this, but it seemed no matter what he did, he kept getting dragged into the plot. Lucy then laid back down, saying she'd relayed the message and was going back to sleep. Ed couldn't believe this. She was like a stray cat, and with her ability to bounce through the air, she could pretty much go wherever she pleased. With him living in the middle of nowhere, this was the perfect place to hide from her maids. Ed came to the realization that there was no way he could stop her from bugging him. The next day, Lucy dropped from the sky and flopped onto the ground half asleep. This monster again, Ed thought. He had set up a snare trap nearby with a couple of pieces of jerky as bait. Lucy noticed it and asked if she could have some. He said no, already annoyed that she was here bothering him. She grabbed a piece anyway and triggered the trap, to Ed's frustration. Then she casually commented that it had an interesting taste. Ed stared. She had come here twice now, which meant she'd probably keep coming unless he found a way to shoo her away. He knew all the strategies. There was no way to defeat Lucy. But she did have one weakness. While she munched on the jerky, Ed mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he had seen some maids on his way back to camp. They said they were looking for her. Lucy froze mid-bite. Then she dropped the jerky and said she had totally forgotten, but she had something to do. Then whoosh! She flew up into the air, leaving only a cloud of dust behind. Luckily, Ed remembered something from her character info. Every day, Lucy tried to escape the dormitory maids who were supposed to take care of her. Well, that was one problem taken care of, he thought, looking up at the sky. Time to get back to work. Today the school was running mock combat training duels. Only basic magic was allowed. Anything stronger would get you disqualified. All for student safety. The format was simple. One-on-one matches. The winner advanced, the loser was out. It would go on like that until the final round. All the big players were here. Princess Penia, Ziggs, Lortel, Yenneka, Lucy, Clevius. But the most important one was the protagonist, Taylor, the failed swordmaster. Ed's eyes lit up. The next match was Taylor's. He couldn't help it. Even knowing the outcome of every fight, he still wanted to watch this one. Then Yenneka showed up beside him, greeting him with a bright and friendly smile. Ed looked annoyed. He thought he had driven her off after asking to borrow money. If Lucy was a stray cat, Yenneka was definitely more like a cute puppy. She showed him the list of competitors and their matchups. Ed didn't care. Yenneka tilted her head, surprised he wasn't interested. Didn't he want to know who he was up against? He froze. He had totally forgotten he was even signed up for this. In the original story, by now, he would have already been kicked out of the academy. He hadn't even thought about participating. Now concerned, he looked down at the paper and scanned the bracket. His eyes widened. He was up against the princess. Before Ed could even worry about the matchup, the announcer called out the next round. Taylor's match was about to begin. Ed immediately sat up with excitement. It was no wonder he paid so much attention to him. He had played through the game so many times trying to get the best ending. After all the pain and failure, he'd ended up with a strange sense of loyalty toward the protagonist. He clenched his fists and looked toward the ring with wide eyes. He would always cheer him on. The announcer asked where Taylor's opponent was. Lucy Mayreal. Ed looked around. Where was she? She couldn't miss this. He glanced across the arena, then spotted something suspicious, just under one of the spare platforms. That hair. He walked over, crouched down, and pulled her out, still half asleep. He tugged on her cheek, trying to wake her up. She grumbled something about being hungry and asked if he had any jerky. He shouted at her to get up and do the duel first. She stumbled toward the ring, still yawning. The announcer introduced the competitors, and the match began. Ed leaned forward. He remembered this fight like the back of his hand. It was important. After getting knocked down, Taylor would pick up a sword and cut through Lucy's magic. That was the moment he took his first real step forward. It was the only time Lucy had ever lost. Ed was already emotional, his hands clenched tight with anticipation. This was such a good scene. The signal was given. Taylor charged forward, fists raised, wielding a pair of knuckle dusters. Lucy didn't even blink. She casually raised a hand and blasted him backward with a wave of basic magic, slamming him into the wall, still yawning. The crowd was stunned. But Ed wasn't worried. He knew this part. He was waiting for the real moment. Taylor pulled himself up. He dropped the knuckle dusters and reached for a sword. Ed leaned in, heart pounding. This was it. This was the part where he broke through. Taylor dashed forward again, sword in hand, aiming straight for her. Ed braced for the moment. Lucy was supposed to cast a lightning spell here. But what he saw made his eyes widen. She wasn't using lightning. It was wind magic. The wind wrapped around the blade, halting it completely. Taylor pushed forward, trying to force it through, but the pressure wouldn't budge. Then the shape of a large wolf's head began to form in the swirling air. With a deep roar, it exploded outward, launching Taylor across the arena. He slammed into one of the support pillars high up in the stands, stuck there for a moment, then dropped to the ground with a heavy thud. The crowd went silent. Then came the cheers. The announcer called the match. Lucy Mayriel was the winner. Ed sat frozen. She had used wind magic? That wasn't how it was supposed to go. Taylor lost. Ed watched as Taylor walked out of the arena, shoulders low, head down. This could be bad. Leaving him now could ruin everything. Without thinking, Ed ran after him, straight past Lucy, who asked if she could have her jerky now. He didn't stop. All he could think about was the wind spirit Marilda. Lucy had never formed a contract with that spirit before. But the story had changed. She stayed at his camp, and that must have led to her meeting Marilda, a butterfly effect already set in motion. As Ed ran toward the exit, he passed the princess. The announcer was calling their match. He ran right past her and through the door, not even giving her a chance to say what she was going to say. This moment, it was supposed to be the turning point, the one that gave Taylor the confidence to take the path of the Swordmaster. He finally caught up to him outside. His words came quickly and without hesitation. He told Taylor he had nothing to be ashamed of. He had fought a monster, and no one would have fared better. The result didn't matter. What mattered was that he had done his best. Taylor didn't respond. But Ed didn't need a reply. He meant every word. This character had to stay on his path. If Ed wanted any chance of avoiding the main plot, then Taylor needed to keep moving forward. Ed stood in the ring across from the princess. He bowed respectfully and told her it was his honour to battle her. The princess returned the gesture. Around them, the crowd began to murmur. Whispers spread quickly. Most of them thought Ed was mocking Taylor when he told him not to give up. The princess admitted that before she might have believed that too, but this time felt different. She had seen the way he spoke to Taylor. It wasn't for show. He was sincere. Her ability confirmed it. The duel began. The princess started gathering her magic, preparing a spell. She told Ed that he was a distraction, and she would rather settle it here, in the ring. A burst of water shot his way. She had been curious how Ed might handle it, knowing he relied mostly on wind and fire. But the fight was already over. The blast hit clean. Ed was sent flying and dropped to the ground. He didn't move to get up. To her surprise, he admitted his defeat. The crowd laughed. Some even groaned. Was that really it? Ed bowed from where he knelt and thanked the princess as the announcer declared her the winner. Ed had no time to waste. He threw the match on purpose so he could go after Taylor. As soon as the duel ended, he was sprinting through the halls, searching. Every second counted. He stopped at a corner and glanced around, catching his breath. That was when a nearby door swung open. The princess stepped out, panting. She had run after him. She asked what was wrong with him, why he had thrown the match, why he couldn't wait to get off the stage. Before he could answer, she started rambling. Something about the other students bothering her. Her voice was strained, pace uneven. Then she started going in on him. Everything was piling up. and now he was adding to her problems. Ed stood there and watched as she unravelled. Her usual composure was slipping. He stepped forward and placed both hands gently on her shoulders. He told her to take a deep breath and calm down. She paused, blinking at him, and slowly did as he said. After a few breaths, her face turned red. Now embarrassed, she buried her face in her hands and told him to forget what just happened. Ed tried to back away, but she kept talking. She said it was a bad habit and apologised, explaining that growing up in the palace had made her a little paranoid sometimes. Then she said she was going to be direct. She asked if he had done everything on purpose, getting kicked out of the dorm, confronting Taylor, pushing himself to the edge just to get disowned, because he knew his family had dark secrets and that was the only way out. She was sharper than he expected, but he couldn't give her answers. Not yet. He told her he didn't know anything about that. That only made her angrier. His behaviour didn't make any sense, and she was getting fed up. She shouted at him in frustration, demanding to know why he wouldn't just give her a straight answer. Then she gave up. She told him he could go. He had been staring at the door the whole time anyway. He thanked her and turned to leave. But before stepping out, he paused and looked back at her. He said he couldn't imagine the weight of all the problems she was dealing with. He told her she looked tired and reminded her that this wasn't the royal court. It was Silvenia Academy. She should try to take it easy, maybe even enjoy her time here. The princess didn't say anything. She just stood there, stunned. Someone had seen through her mask. Ed was running again. He had wasted too much time. Taylor had already disappeared into the maze of corridors, and the longer he delayed, the harder it would be to catch up. He turned another corner and finally found him. Taylor was sitting on a bench, hunched forward, holding the broken remains of his sword. Ed slowed to a stop. He stood there for a moment, unsure what to say. Before he could speak, a voice rang out. A girl stepped between them, arms out, shielding Taylor. She told Ed not to come any closer. It was Ayla Triss, Taylor's childhood friend. Taylor stood up and looked directly at him. He said he could see Ed hadn't been expelled after all. Ed looked at his face. The fight was still in his eyes, of course. He didn't need Ed's help. He had someone like Ayla who would have rushed to him no matter what. She always did. Taylor asked what he wanted. Ed let out a quiet sigh of relief, then turned and began to walk away. With his back still to Taylor, he raised a hand and waved as he told him his sword skills were impressive. It wasn't just relief that the story hadn't fallen apart, it was something deeper. After everything he had done, after all the interference, the character he had spent so long playing was still standing, still fighting. Taylor was okay. That weight in Ed's chest, the quiet fear that he might have broken something, finally lifted. He left the building and entered the courtyard. A loud explosion echoed across the grounds, flames raging from the roof. It must be that time already. It had to be Yenneka's battle, the duel between Yenneka and Lortel. Taylor was probably watching right now. He should be paying attention. After all, this was the final boss of Act 1. The crowd cheered as Yenneka was declared the winner. Lortel didn't walk away unscathed. She was carried out on a stretcher, and Yenneka stood nearby, watching with a worried look. Ed glanced at her from a distance. She had a lot of friends, more than he remembered. That was good, he thought. Maybe that would help keep her away from his camp. 2 weeks had passed since the mock battles. Ed had managed to stay away from the main characters and focus on survival and studying. His fishing net had turned out better than expected. Today, he was hauling in his catch, wearing nothing but his underwear. He paused for a moment, glancing down at his arms. There was a bit more definition now. His strength stat had finally reached 6, still barely above average, but it felt like progress. Someone was watching him. He turned his head. Yenneka stood nearby, her hands over her face, but peeking between her fingers. Her cheeks were flushed. She asked if he liked walking around half naked. Ed stayed unfazed. He pointed out that she was the one snooping around his camp, uninvited. He asked why she was here. She said this place felt like a secret hideout. Coming here made her feel like she was on an adventure. She sat on a log by the fire, her expression growing more serious. She said she had come to talk. Ed asked if she really wanted advice from someone like him. She told him she had hurt a student during the duels. It had been weeks ago, but it was still bothering her. Lortel had to be carried out after the match. Ed reminded her that Lortel had used intermediate magic first. She was just defending herself. That probably wouldn't matter to someone like Yenneka. She was kind by nature. She said it didn't feel any better. Even if it was self-defense, she still felt responsible. She asked if he thought she should apologise. She had already tried, but her friends had stopped her, insisting she had done nothing wrong. Ed told her if she believed it was the right thing to do, then she should apologise. She nodded quietly. Ed knew why people liked her. She was sincere. She didn't try to act perfect, she just cared too much. But even someone like her had to make choices on her own. She told Ed she knew he was different. He never just jumped to take her side. She stretched her arms up and looked toward the trees. Ed told her he was sorry if that bothered her. She quickly replied that it didn't. She looked at him again. He wasn't like the Ed she remembered from last year. She had noticed it when he asked for money. He hadn't meant it. He had only been trying to put some distance between them. That only made her more curious. She said it was nice that he didn't treat her any differently from anyone else. She smiled as she said it, then added that she wished more people were like him. The next day, Ed walked the halls of the academy, thinking about all the ways he could die here. Any small choice could trigger a chain reaction. That's how it always went in the game. And now he was sweating, trying to lose the pest tailing him. Another main character. He needed to get rid of her before he got caught up in something. He turned and asked how long she planned to follow him. The girl replied that she didn't expect to have to work so hard for his attention. Of course he was ignoring her. The one and only child of the business mogul Elta Kehalan wouldn't leave him alone. Lortel Kehalan. She grinned with confidence and asked if she could purchase 2 hours of his time. Lortel Kehalan wasn't just another student. She was considered a kind of villain in the story. Not evil exactly, but manipulative. The kind of person who always had an angle. And in the original route, the player usually had to choose between her and the princess. Ed wasn't planning to get anywhere near that decision. As soon as he processed that thought, his legs were already moving. He was walking away without another word. There was no way he was falling for her silver tongue. Lortel followed, acting sweet. She said she just wanted to help. It wouldn't hurt to listen. She tried compliments next, said it was impressive he was still studying, even while living like this. Then she switched gears. 3 gold coins rested between her fingers as she held out her hand, palm open. She heard he was close to Yenneka, and she wanted his help befriending her. That was a lot of money. A full month's salary from a solid job, at least. Ed leaned in slightly and asked if this was how she made connections, just throwing money at people. She slipped the coins into his pocket and told him to keep them. The more allies she had, the better. He realised she must already see it, the power struggle that was building. She was preparing for a political showdown with the princess, a battle to decide who would control the academy. He told her all right, they should shake on it. She smiled, thinking money never failed. People in his situation couldn't say no. Preying on desperation made things easy. At least, that's what she thought. When she looked at her open palm again, the coins were there. He had slipped them back into her hand during the handshake. She watched Ed walking away without looking back. Interesting, she said to herself. She wasn't insulted. If anything, she was impressed. Ed kept walking, trying to act cool. He really could have used that money, but getting between those 2 girls... He shuddered at the thought. He wouldn't survive it. Later that night, Yenneka ran into Lortel in the girls' dormitory. Lortel apologised for what happened during their duel. She said she couldn't help herself. She just wanted to see how strong Yenneka really was. Yenneka glanced at the bandages around Lortel's arms and asked how her recovery was going. Lortel told her not to worry. She'd be fully healed soon enough. Yenneka then asked if she was disappointed that Ed had rejected her offer. Lortel's eyes widened. She hadn't expected her to know. Yenneka apologised, but said the spirits loved to gossip, and they couldn't wait to share something once it reached the wind. She added that not everything could be bought with money, it seemed. Then she paused, thinking back to Ed's decision. Knowing his situation, it left her quietly impressed. She apologised for prying and said she needed to get some rest. She was preparing to try forming a contract with a high-ranking spirit soon. Before heading off, she told Lortel she hoped she recovered quickly. Lortel watched her leave. She hadn't expected that side of Yenneka, not the carefree and sweet girl everyone saw on the outside. She was sharper than she let on. The next day, Ed was going through his usual chores around camp. Laundry hung to dry, water simmered over the fire, traps were reset, and Lucy was there like always. She sniffed the air and said something smelled familiar, then shot into the sky with a gust of wind, knocking his laundry clean off the line as she flew off. Before Ed could even groan, someone else stepped out from the trees. A maid walked into the clearing holding a neatly packed food basket. He recognised her right away, Belle Meyer, the same maid who'd kicked him out of the dorm back at the start. She looked around the camp with quiet interest, then glanced at the shack he called home. She hadn't realised he was living like this, then added that, for what it's worth, it looked like living out here had changed him for the better. She told him not to be so formal. If he wanted, he could treat her poorly like he used to back in the dorm. Ed said he didn't want to. That caught her off guard. He told her he couldn't treat someone like that when they were always working so hard. Belle didn't have any scripted scenes in the original game, so he didn't really know how to talk to her. In the end, he just asked straight up about what was in the basket. Fortunately, she didn't mind sharing. Ed picked up a few valuable tips about the local herbs, mushrooms and fruits, things that weren't in any book he'd read. Everything was coming together nicely. The fishing net was set, the meat was drying on the rack, and now he could even make herbal tea. His spells were still basic, but after using them non-stop, they'd levelled up more than expected. This survival thing was finally starting to feel manageable. He looked out toward the mountains in the distance. With the sun sinking low, the peaks were bathed in gold. After a day of non-stop work, the quiet felt earned. He actually started to think he could enjoy this life. Then something flickered in the sky, a glint followed by a streak of light. The next moment, the camp exploded. A shockwave sent Ed flying backward as the ground cracked and dirt sprayed everywhere. When the dust finally settled, he pushed himself up, coughing and dazed. Right in the middle of the wrecked camp, sitting casually in a crater like nothing had happened, was Lucy Mayreal. Lucy sat trembling in the centre of the crater. Her expression was pale, her voice uneven. She said she'd almost died. Ed, still brushing off dust, asked what she meant. He couldn't think of anything that would leave her this shaken. Her face turned cold as she named the culprit. Belle Meyer. She explained that she skipped class like usual, but this time Belle had snapped. It wasn't her fault, she said. Belle had been acting strangely, almost like she was worried about something else entirely. Lucy claimed she barely remembered what happened. One moment it felt like Belle was going to lash out, and the next, instinct kicked in and she teleported away, right into his camp. Ed wasn't impressed. His shelter had been destroyed over something like this. Then Lucy asked if he had any jerky. That did it. He bonked her on the head. There was no barrier to deflect it. That was strange. Normally she would have blocked something like that without a thought. She winced and rubbed her head, saying she was out of mana after the teleportation spell. Ed smiled at that. He gave her another flick on the forehead, for the camp. Then one more, for poor Belle. Ed knew he needed sturdier shelter. That meant real lumber, something better than scrap branches tied with rope. For that, he needed knowledge. He made his way to the library. The place was mostly empty, the sun long gone, and only the faint shuffle of pages filled the air. A distant voice called out to announce closing time. Someone approached him, bright-eyed and friendly. She commented on how focused he looked. Ed glanced up and replied that he hadn't realised it had gotten so late. She smiled and told him not to worry, Seeing someone study so seriously made her want to work harder too. She introduced herself as Elka Island, full of energy and clearly expecting a name in return. He hesitated, then gave it. Ed Rothstaler. Her cheerful expression froze. That reaction was familiar by now. He could see the moment the name clicked in her head. She stammered through a polite recovery, saying he wasn't anything like the rumours. She'd heard he was arrogant and knew nothing, but he had just finished several advanced texts in a matter of days. Maybe the rumours were wrong. She mentioned knowing someone else who worked that hard and added that she'd be rooting for him too. Still sitting cross-legged beside his stack of books, Ed looked up and thanked her. She waved and told him to get back safely, then disappeared behind one of the shelves to finish closing duties. That's when he heard it, a distant rumble. The air shifted, the ground trembled and the bookshelves rattled. Volumes began toppling from the upper shelves. And just like that, the quiet night was over. 2 hours later, a group of students gathered at a temporary outpost trying to make sense of the unfolding crisis. In the distance, a massive pillar of light lit up the sky. A complex summoning circle hovered above it, pulsing with dark energy. Ayla stepped forward and said the summoning circle matched descriptions she'd studied. It looked like a ritual, one powerful enough to summon Glasscan, the highest-ranking spirit of darkness. The princess stiffened. Only one student had a high enough spiritual affinity to attempt something like that. Yenneka Palirova. If they didn't act fast, the school's protective barrier wouldn't hold. And if Glasscan was truly being summoned, the academy would be in grave danger. The top students began discussing a plan. If they worked together, there was a chance they could stop it. Clevius didn't look convinced. He pointed out the number of mid-rank spirits they'd need to cut through, and there were at least 2 high-rank ones in the way. It was a death trap. Lortel questioned whether Yenneka could even manage something this extreme. Even with talent, it was beyond reckless. Ayla guessed Velospa's power was amplifying Yenneka's strength. That kind of boost could explain the impossible scale of the summoning. She reminded them that dark spirits were the natural enemies of elementalists. They were powerful, manipulative, and dangerous. Elementalists needed pure hearts to resist being overtaken. If Yenneka had lost control, it wasn't entirely her fault, but that didn't change the threat they were facing. Zig stepped forward and reminded her that this was her call. As the highest-ranking noble present, only she had the authority to give the order. Everyone turned to her. She stood in silence, then recalled Ed's words from earlier. She declared that they would act in 1 hour. Only the strongest students her knight, and those who had proven themselves would enter. It was too dangerous for the rest. She accepted full responsibility. A student rushed in, reporting that Audrey Hall and the potion depository were under attack. They were cut off. No backup was coming. The princess nodded grimly. That left just them. Then another student ran in. 2 people were still inside the student library. One was Elka Aylan. Ziggs froze. He asked for confirmation. The student nodded. Ziggs grabbed her, frantic. Was she absolutely sure? She confirmed again. Ziggs turned toward the library, ready to run. Lortel stepped in, reminding him he was the strongest one here. They couldn't afford to lose him. The princess backed her up, said there was another second-year student with Elka, so she shouldn't be alone. She turned to the girl and asked who it was. The student librarian hesitated. Ziggs stepped forward again, this time grabbing her by the collar. She stammered, then finally said the name. Ed Rothstaler. Then she burst into tears, explaining that she had tried to get that jerk out before closing hours, but he wouldn't leave. She was so mad, she left Elka to deal with him. Elka didn't believe the rumours, so she didn't mind. The princess tried to calm Ziggs, but his eyes had already changed. He launched into the sky, cutting through the dark spirits with furious speed. His voice echoed across the sky, shouting Ed's name. The night burned with rising chaos, and the true storm had only just begun. Ziggs was known as the Spear of Nature. He came from the northern grasslands of the Empire, a barbaric land where the Emperor's rule held no weight, a place where letting your guard down, even for a moment, could mean your death. He was descended from the nomads who had once wandered those open plains. By the time he was old enough to fend for himself, he was already alone. He didn't know why, he couldn't remember. It had always just been him. But somehow, he survived. He traded with a nearby village, bringing in meat from his kills. He learned quickly what was valuable and what wasn't. Still, the villagers never looked at him without suspicion. Watching a wild-looking nomad dragging deer corpses through town didn't inspire comfort. They whispered about him. Some thought he might eat humans. Others wondered if he was even human himself. But one girl approached him without hesitation. She smiled and asked his name. He told her, and she laughed, not cruelly, but with joy. She introduced herself cheerfully, beaming as she explained that he looked like a wolf walking on 2 legs. In that moment, Ziggs, who had roamed the endless grasslands alone for as long as he could remember, felt something stir. A tear rolled down his cheek before he even understood why. That was the day he met Elka. And that was the day he realised he had been lonely his entire life. She introduced him to her father, who took him in at her request. From that moment on, Ziggs began learning how to live among others. He stopped being a wolf and learned how to be human. And now he was racing through the air with only one thought in mind. He had to protect her. Ziggs flew through the sky, heading straight for the library. The air roared in his ears, but his focus stayed locked on one thing, Elka. He'd heard the rumours about Ed Rothstaler, everything the boy had done before being kicked out of the dorms. The expulsion, the strange behaviour. It didn't matter whether any of it was true. If there was even a chance she was in danger, then nothing else mattered. If he had to become a beast again, so be it. He crashed through a window and sprinted down the hallway, eyes sharp, steps relentless. Then he saw him. Ed sat slouched outside the reading rooms, bruised and bloodied, leaning against the wall. He looked exhausted. Ziggs grabbed him by the collar and dragged him upright. He demanded to know where Elka was. Ed gave a simple answer, reading room 3. Ziggs let go without a word and bolted down the corridor. He slammed the door open and shouted her name. There she was, right in front of him. Asleep on the table, a coat had been draped over her to keep her warm. Ziggs rushed to her side, his hands trembling. He braced himself on the table, his forehead dropping low as he exhaled hard. She was safe. Not a bruise on her. His eyes scanned the room. Bookshelves had been dragged in and arranged around the table like a makeshift wall. The blackout curtains were pulled tight, cloaking the space in soft shadows, likely to keep the spirits from seeing inside. Then his gaze landed on the blackboard. A short message had been scrawled in white chalk. If you wake up, stay in this room and stay calm. Everything will be fine soon. It's dangerous outside. Ziggs read the words again. Someone had gone through all this trouble to keep her safe. That's when he noticed the blood. The coat was covered in blotches. Her breathing was steady. It wasn't her blood. He turned toward the door and saw the trail. Drops and smears of it leading out. It had been Ed's. Even while injured, he'd taken care of her. Why? 3 hours earlier. The library had begun to shake. Books tumbled from the shelves, crashing to the floor one after another. One of them had struck Elka on the head. She'd passed out, her body limp against his shoulder. Ed gritted his teeth. All the training he'd been doing was paying off now. He gently lowered her onto a table, then rushed to the nearest window. Outside, the sky had changed. A massive summoning circle had formed in the air above the campus. The glass can arc had already begun. He quickly closed the curtains. Taylor should take care of that, just like he was meant to. There was no need to get involved in the part of the story meant for the main characters. He needed to stay out of it. He couldn't change the future. But the danger was coming fast. Spirits would be all over the campus soon. He started dragging bookshelves, trying to secure the room as best he could. Then he paused. Spirits. He couldn't see them. Not normally, not without the right stat. In order to interact with spirits, you needed spiritual resonance or understanding, or both. But something had changed. Because of Yenneka's summoning, the dark spirits had taken physical form. That meant he could see them now, touch them, fight them. This wouldn't last. He probably wouldn't get a better opportunity than this. Ed stepped out of the room, one last glance at Elka, safe, unconscious, and warm under his coat. Then he turned away, and quietly thanked Yenneka as he went to find the spirits. Back in the present, Ed sat slumped outside room 3, resting against the wall. During the fight, he'd managed to raise a few key skills, spiritual resonance and spiritual understanding. It wasn't much, but it was progress. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough to form a contract now. Zig stepped out, carrying Elka on his back, still unconscious but unharmed. He glanced at Ed, then asked what he was doing there, and why he looked like he'd been through a war. Ed told him he'd been training. Zig stared for a moment, then let out a breath. He lowered his head and bowed, thanking him for keeping Elka safe. He promised to repay the debt. Ed didn't respond right away. He had almost forgotten how close those two were, but now that he thought about it, Ziggs was one of the main characters. He had always stayed close to Taylor, loyal, grounded, and capable in a fight. If Ziggs was here, then that meant he'd left the others behind to search for Elka. He told him to get her to safety, and then go back. Taylor would need help. Ziggs frowned. Why bring up Taylor? They'd never even spoken. Ed told him Taylor was the only one who could cut through the fire spirit's hide. Ziggs didn't argue. He bowed his head again, then turned and carried Elka away. Ed sank back down, watching him disappear down the hall. That should get things moving. The boss fight was coming soon. But something still bugged him. Ziggs had said he'd never spoken to Taylor. That couldn't be right. They were supposed to have a mock battle in about a month. Taylor lost, but earned Ziggs' respect with an elemental slash. That hadn't happened yet. Yenneka's event wasn't supposed to trigger until after that battle, but it had already started, which meant the slash skill they needed to win wasn't going to be ready in time. The story was drifting off course, too much. Ed stared down the hallway, knowing what it meant. He couldn't predict the future anymore. At the student square near the temporary outpost, Ziggs returned to the group. He apologised for being late. The students were battered from the battle, bandaged, bruised, and barely standing, but they were relieved to see him. The princess approached. She told him not to blame himself. Even if he had been there from the start, the first assault still would have failed. A knight stepped forward and addressed her. Without reinforcements, trying again would be reckless. They didn't have the numbers. She looked around at the others. Some were sitting with their heads down, others tending to wounds or broken weapons. The air felt heavy. Their morale had crumbled. She tried to rally them, tried to say something, anything to give them direction, but her voice faltered. The words just wouldn't come. Then someone called out across the square. A voice, calm, clear, and unexpected. Everyone turned. It was Ed. He walked toward the group. He hadn't wanted to get involved, but things had gone too far off track. The princess froze when she saw him. He got straight to the point. They couldn't focus everything on the fire spirit, not this time. They had to split into 2 groups before the summoning finished, and he would lead one of them. No one said a word. The group stood silent, trying to process what they'd just heard. Then Clevius broke the silence. He stepped forward and asked if Ed was crazy. Why would anyone listen to him? Before the tension could escalate, Ziggs raised an arm in front of him and told him to let Ed speak. Ed stepped forward and addressed the group. To reach Yenneka and the dark spirit Velosper, they first had to get past the high-ranking fire spirit Tarkan. They'd already fought it once and barely escaped. Its hide couldn't be pierced by anything they tried. The plan was simple. One group would distract it. The other would sneak past and take on Yenneka and the dark spirit Velosper. Lortel spoke up, her voice calm but firm. This wasn't the same Tarkan she had fought in the arena. They were lucky to escape the first time. She said the plan was too risky. Ed didn't deny it, but if they didn't stop Yenneka now, what would happen to the rest of the school? Ziggs then asked the obvious question, who would be the bait? No one answered. The silence hung in the air until one hand went up. Taylor stepped forward and volunteered. Ed told him to put his hand down. He was needed on the attack team. Taylor tried to argue, claiming he was ready to risk his life. Ed pushed him aside and said this wasn't about sacrifice. Then Ed announced the distraction team, himself, Lortel, and Clevius. The reactions were immediate. Clevius looked horrified, saying he didn't want to die. Lortel politely declined. Ed tried reasoning with them, but it wasn't getting through. Then the princess stepped forward. She backed Ed's plan. She said it made sense. And as the princess, she gave the order. The teams were decided. As the two groups moved out, she called out one final instruction. No one was allowed to die. Ed's group reached their destination near the centre square. Takan was there, still furious, still burning. Lortel glanced at Ed and asked what the plan was to distract it. Ed told her to follow his lead. As long as they stuck to the plan, they'd win for sure. The three of them charged toward the fire spirit. As they ran together, Ed turned to Clevius and said not to worry, he'd do fine. Clevius didn't look convinced at first, but then he gave a small smile and picked up speed, gaining a bit of confidence from Ed's words. He might act cowardly, Ed thought, but that wasn't the full story. Clevius was actually the top combat student from the first-year class. He just didn't believe it himself. Clevius reached the spirit first. As soon as he got close, Takan let out a deafening roar. He flinched, looked back nervously, and asked what the plan was, only to realise the others weren't behind him. Takan lowered its head to meet him, embers flaring from its mouth. Clevius turned and sprinted away, shouting that they tricked him. He shouted as he ran that he wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not far from there, Lortel stood outside, positioned beside one of the outer walls. She thought back to when they'd left Clevius behind to draw Takan's attention. She had asked if that was really his plan all along. To sacrifice Clevius? Ed said he wouldn't die. He reminded her that Clevius was the top student in year 1 and that he wouldn't go down so easily. Then he told her role was the most important. She was going to open the path for the attack team and deal the most damage to Takan. Now, standing in position, Lortel focused. She was ready. She gathered energy into her hand. Magic circles formed behind her, glowing with energy. She aimed at the wall, then fired. A massive blast tore through it, revealing the attack group waiting on the other side. They looked stunned. Lortel gave a quick smile and told them it was their time to shine. As they ran past her, she remembered something. She had done something like this before, during her duel with Yenneka. She blew up the roof back then. That's why he chose her, she thought. He really was something else. Back at the square, Clevius came flying out of another doorway, still being chased by Takan and still screaming. He shouted that he wouldn't forget this betrayal. Lortel looked toward the square. She remembered Ed's last words to her, that they needed the spirit right there, in that open space. But even with Takan where they wanted it, they still had no way to break through its hide. She remembered the bag Ed was holding when he left. He said he would handle it. He said he would break its defence, then they would finish it. Ed sprinted through the halls, heading straight for the rooftop. He reached the stairs and took them 2 at a time. They couldn't break through Takan's hide. Taylor hadn't learned the elemental slash yet. That part of the story hadn't happened, which meant they needed something else, something stronger. He reached the rooftop and kicked the door open. And there she was. Lucy, sound asleep, exactly where she always used to nap before she started showing up at his camp. He let out a breath, walked over and picked her up, slinging her over his shoulder. Still half asleep, she mumbled that she was trying to nap. Then her nose twitched as Ed opened the bag. She opened one eye and mumbled again. She caught the scent of jerky. Ed crammed a bunch of jerky into her mouth. Her eyes blinked open in surprise, but she was too groggy to react. Her cheeks were stuffed with jerky, strips still sticking out of her mouth. He grabbed the back of her shirt and crouched, lining up his aim. He told her the target was the lizard. Then he hurled her through the air. Lucy flew across the sky, cheeks puffed out from the jerky still in her mouth. The wind hit her face as she tried to yell that Ed was mean, but all that came out was a muffled noise through the food. Ed watched her sail toward the square. Takan was still locked on Clevius and Lortel, right where he wanted it. Then the impact landed. Lucy came to a sudden stop mid-air, right in front of Takan. Her eyes flashed. A surge of lightning exploded from her, slamming into the fire spirit with explosive force. The blast lit up the entire square. Energy roared outward, shaking the ground beneath them. Lortel raised a barrier just in time to protect herself, and Clevius, as the force blew them back. Even Ed had to grip the railing to hold steady. As the smoke cleared, he narrowed his eyes and looked down at the square. Takan's armoured hide had been broken. That would be enough. He turned and headed for the stairs. Now he's going to take the kill. Trapped in place by the spirit's chains, Yenneka's mind wandered. She remembered her mother telling her how proud she was, how deeply she loved her. Her friends, always encouraging, had called her the hope of the second years. Even the teachers had placed their faith in her, claiming that without her, their year would have gone down as the worst in academy history. All that pressure had built up over time, and now it had brought her here. The attack group finally reached her. Despite the ghostly chains wrapped around her body, binding her to the massive dark spirit's chest, Yenneka managed a small smile as she greeted them. Ed reached the square and found Clevius still barely avoiding Takan's relentless attacks. Lortel stood nearby, actively supporting him with spells. He asked where Lucy was. Lortel told him she went back to sleep and was now rolling around inside a protective barrier somewhere. Then she told him that even with Takan's hide destroyed, the spirit was still far too strong. Her ice spears had barely scratched it. Ed said that to finish it off, they needed to strike its neck. Her magic wasn't suited for that, so he would handle it. She asked why it couldn't be Clevius. Wasn't Ed in the magic department? Clevius used a sword. It made more sense. Ed motioned toward the terrified student still running around. Was he in any shape to do it? Lortel looked and agreed. No, he definitely wasn't. Ed told her to trust him. If she could slow the spirit down, he'd handle the rest, even if it meant putting his life in her hands. She told him that was quite the gamble. He said it wasn't gambling like betting money. He was staking his life on it, more like an investment. That got a grin out of her. She told him that was her specialty. Then she began gathering her magical power, forming ice spears as circles of energy appeared around her. She said that if he trusted her with his life, she would do the same and trust him back. Ed dashed toward Takan while Clevius finally collapsed from exhaustion. The fire spirit let out a deep roar and began gathering flames in its mouth, preparing to unleash a powerful breath attack. Ed steadied his breathing as he focused wind energy into his palm, the same energy he'd used so many times before, chopping firewood back at camp. He needed to reach the base of the creature's neck. That was the only chance. Suddenly, a massive claw pierced through the clouds above. Clevius looked up in horror. That was Glasscan's right arm. The summoning must have been nearing completion. The other team had to be close to defeating it. But that massive limb could distract anyone, and Ed quickly turned to check on Lortel. He didn't have time to check. Takan's fire burst from its mouth, only to be intercepted mid-air by a surge of ice magic shielding Ed from the flames. Lortel shouted across the battlefield. Now was his chance. Even with that monstrous claw looming above, she hadn't faltered for a moment. Ed didn't waste the moment. As Takan flinched from the deflected breath, briefly distracted, he sprinted forward. Sliding beneath its body, he lined up the shot and unleashed the full force of his wind slash. The energy tore upward, slicing clean through the weakened neck. System messages surged into Ed's view as the spirit collapsed. His experience points skyrocketed, and both his spirit resonance and understanding skills leveled up multiple times. Then one final message appeared. He had unlocked the spirit contract ability. Ed barely had a moment to process it before something caught his eye above. A figure flew toward the massive claw in the sky, surrounded by pulsing energy. That had to be Taylor. He watched as the figure closed in at lightning speed. Taylor's sword flashed with elemental power, slicing through the claw with a flurry of strikes that shattered it into fragments. The sky lit up. Then the giant summoning circle above them exploded, a thunderous shockwave rippling through the air as the last of the summoning was destroyed. As Taylor fell from above, his hair now completely white, Ed couldn't help but stare. That's the protagonist for you, he thought, always stealing the spotlight. But even he had to admit it was an incredible display. It was over. Dawn broke slowly over the battlefield. Ed, Lortel and Clevia sat beneath a tree at the edge of the square, completely spent. Lucy, unbothered as always, was sprawled on her back next to them, fast asleep like nothing had happened. Lortel sat glancing at Ed. She told him she'd met a lot of people who liked to talk big. Most of them turned out to be liars and cowards. Ed admitted she wasn't wrong. That couldn't be all he had to say, she asked. They'd nearly died back there. Then she smiled faintly and extended a hand toward him. This time, she said, she wanted to introduce herself properly. Ed shook her hand. When she let go, he looked down and found 3 gold coins in his palm. She stuck out her tongue and told him she'd won this round, and that she'd be seeing him again. Ed watched her walk off, already wondering what she was planning next. Footsteps approached in a hurry. Ed looked up to see Taylor heading toward him, his hair still completely white. Ed immediately recognised the change. That hair colour could only mean one thing. Taylor had awakened his swordmaster skill. Taylor stopped in front of him and lowered his head. Despite admitting he still didn't like Ed, and had good reason not to, he bowed even lower and thanked him. Clevius pushed himself up and shouted at Taylor not to bow to someone like Ed. He was almost killed because of him. Ziggs arrived with the others and told Clevius to quiet down, and the rest of the group seemed to agree. Clevius dropped back to the ground, covering his face with both hands. The princess stepped forward and told Ed that his actions helped save the school. She said she would inform the student council of everything he had done. Ed stood up from the tree and told her not to bother. Lucy had dealt most of the damage, and Taylor was the one who defeated both Velospa and Glasscan. Elvira peeked around from behind the princess and smirked at Ed, asking if he was avoiding praise because he was embarrassed or something. Ziggs scolded her, reminding her to show proper respect to older students. She hissed back at him, demanding to know why everyone was suddenly taking Ed's side. Ed stood a little farther back, watching them argue. He'd done everything he could to stay out of their way, to avoid getting involved. But now that he was here, seeing them all up close, after spending so long with them in the game, he couldn't help but feel something. He was really here. And even if it was just for this moment, he allowed himself to enjoy it, because he knew the future still held many dangers, and he wanted no part of them. He quietly slipped away from the group and made his way into the collapsed part of the school, carefully stepping over fallen beams and scattered rubble. In the middle of the ruined training hall stood a lone wooden cabinet, barely intact. If his hunch was right, that was the place. He walked over, gripped the handle, and opened the door. Inside, huddled in a small space, was Yenneka, bruised, scraped, and curled into a ball. She looked up at him, her eyes squinting against the faint light. Then slowly, she smiled. While the others were busy catching their breath and celebrating, swept up in the end of the fight, Ed remembered the one person still waiting to be found. The worst had passed, but the weight it left behind still lingered. Ed found himself looking at Yenneka again, remembering what Lortel had told him earlier. She had a theory about why Yenneka lost control. She once glimpsed Yenneka's room, letters pinned up, gifts covering the desk and floor. She took care of them all. That weight opened the door for Glasscan. Ed wondered why it happened so soon, maybe because Taylor lost to Lucy, and the praise shifted to Yenneka. That pressure had built from there, and Lucy had only won because of Marilda, who she made a contract with after staying at Ed's camp. It all circled back to him. Inside the cabinet, Yenneka stirred and joked she finally understood why Lucy liked sleeping there. It was cosy. With a sheepish smile, she admitted it felt like everyone had forgotten her. She caused all that chaos and figured someone would at least be mad. But no one cared. Ed told her it was her own fault for hiding. She laughed and agreed. Then she hugged her knees and grew quiet. She didn't want to be found yet. She just needed more time to cry. Ed remembered Marilda's request to save Yenneka. Maybe it asked him because she could be at ease with him, with no pressure or expectations. Yenneka had failed to summon a high spirit and was nearly consumed by a powerful dark one. After all her effort to please everyone. Now, strangely, she almost looked relieved. Ed didn't know if it would help, but he said she did great. That was all it took. Her expression cracked and the tears came, everything she'd held back flooding out. In the game, Act 1's boss never got a scene like this. Now Ed was backstage, watching what came after the fight, and what he saw stunned him. Spirits, dozens of them, gathered around Yenneka to comfort her. This was the ending Act 1 was meant to have. Then the system chimed. The low-ranking spirit Elgo has shown interest in you. The low-ranking spirit Dries has shown interest in you. The high-ranking spirit Marilda has shown great interest in you. 10 days passed. Yenneka pleaded guilty to everything and accepted whatever punishment the Academy deemed appropriate. But students and teachers defended her. The princess testified that Yenneka had been controlled and wouldn't press charges. Lortel, always with a motive, offered to cover the damages in exchange for the Academy cutting Elter Company's supply tax in half. Yenneka lost her financial aid, her awards, and the right to stay in Ophelis Hall starting next semester. Instead, she received 10 days probation and 20 days suspension. Yet she wasn't expelled. Clara and Annie's took her out for tea, agreeing not to mention what happened. Yenneka sat at the table, twirling her hair and staring into the distance, her cheeks flushed. Then she asked what they thought about love. They both froze, then stood up with wide eyes, asking where this was coming from. Yenneka said it was just for a friend, someone who dreamed about a handsome prince in a field of flowers, and the dreams wouldn't go away. Clara narrowed her eyes. Yenneka had been locked up on probation for 10 days. When could she have talked to anyone? Anise, clearly nervous, asked what else the friend had said. Yenneka, blushing harder, continued, admitting she kept seeing his face everywhere. Anise, now bright red, turned and bolted across the square, shouting about helping a teacher, clearly just trying to escape the embarrassment. Clara watched her go, then turned back to Yenneka with a sigh. She said her friend should stay true to her feelings, but also be careful. If word got out, people would talk, and it might make things difficult for both of them. Yenneka's eyes widened. She hadn't thought of that. She quickly thanked Clara and hurried off. Clara banged her forehead against the table. She'd held it together. Ed made his way through the forest, tools in hand, heading back to camp. The princess had told the headmaster how Ed had helped protect the school. In return, the academy covered his tuition for the next semester. For once, he could spend money on supplies. He looked down at his gear, satisfied. Up ahead, he spotted Yenneka standing awkwardly near the trail, fidgeting. He hadn't spoken to her since the incident, but now that Act 1 was over, maybe it was finally okay to be friendly. He waved and called out, asking how her probation went. She jumped and ducked behind a nearby tree, stammering a quiet greeting. Then she stood frozen for a moment, thinking to herself that she needed to be honest with her feelings. But no words came. Instead, she spun around and ran off, shouting she had something to do. Ed watched her run, confused. Then he looked at his tools. It was time to get to work. The days passed as Ed focused on building his cabin. With his new supplies, progress felt steady. The semester ended. His grades were strong, excellent written scores and improving practical work. Yet Yenneka kept avoiding him. Whenever they crossed paths, she turned away. Clara and Anise were always nearby, both glaring at him as if guarding her. On the 20th day, the cabin's frame was nearly done. While checking his snares, he found Lucy curled up in one of them, fast asleep. He decided to stop using jerky as bait. On another day, Belle Meyer visited with herbs and mushrooms. She asked how things were with Yenneka. Ed replied that she'd been avoiding him. Belle simply tilted her head, puzzled. Another week passed. He saw Yenneka again, and once more she ran at the sight of him. Clara and Anis were with her, both glaring, but this time Clara paused. Something shifted in her expression. She finally figured it out. The prince Yenneka kept dreaming about was Ed. On day 37, Zig stopped by to help with the roof. He mentioned that Ed had been right about Taylor. He really was a good guy. By day 45, the cabin was complete. Ed sat inside his finished shelter, taking it all in. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. A roof, walls, a space he built for himself, something solid in a shaky life. Yenneka stood just outside in the trees, quietly watching. She was still trying to find the courage to talk to him. Ed lay on the floor, thinking of all the future projects he could take on to expand the camp. A loud bang came from the roof. He stepped outside and saw Lucy sprawled on top, fast asleep. He rolled his eyes. His cabin wasn't a cat tower. Then a voice called out. Yenneka stood nearby, nervously waving. Ed asked what brought her all the way out here. She laughed awkwardly, remembering earlier. While Belle Meyer was brushing her hair, she mentioned Ed's new cabin, surprised he built it alone. Then she leaned in and whispered that she really wanted to look inside. Yenneka had agreed. Belle called it a natural curiosity, completely normal. Now standing before Ed, Yenneka echoed Belle's words, saying she'd been passing by and just wanted a closer look. That was normal, right? Ed rubbed his head and said he guessed so. She complimented the cabin, and when Ed asked if the spirits had told her, she quickly said they only mentioned it in passing. Thinking back to the latest spirit gossip about Ed's shirtless appearance. Ed asked if she wanted to look inside. She blushed, then smiled and nodded. Later they sat near the campfire with warm drinks. Yenneka said she owed so much to everyone who helped her stay in school. Even her friends had offered to cover her tuition, if that's what it took. How could she ever repay such kindness? Ed simply told her, if she couldn't repay it, then don't. Not every good deed needs something in return. She gasped. That had never occurred to her. It was just like her, Ed thought, always weighed down by expectations. That's probably why she declined the help and moved to Dex Hall instead. She didn't want to owe anyone anything. In Ophelis, she would have had her own room, but in Dex Hall she had to share with 7 others. Surrounded by admiring stares again, the pressure would return. The cycle would likely continue. Ed told her she could visit the camp any time if she wanted to be alone. He'd leave her be. Her eyes widened. Then she smiled, saying that would make her happy. She added that if Ed ever needed help, she'd be there. Ed smiled and looked at the sky. The second semester was starting. Everything now centred around an old book, the sage's sealed tome. He thanked her for the offer, but said he had no intention of getting into trouble. He closed his eyes and thought to himself, Taylor could deal with it. He'd lived the quiet life. Ophelis Hall was a place of luxury. Private rooms, personal maids, endless perks. That's where the problem began. As the semester break ended, rainstorms flooded the region. The Academy arranged carriages and boats for returning students, but only for those in Ophelis Hall. They were even granted a grace period, allowing them to arrive several days late without consequence due to the weather. Dex Hall students, on the other hand, were given no assistance. They had to return on their own, rain or not. If they arrived late, they risked demerits. Naturally, they were furious. Which was exactly what Lortel had planned. She had secretly proposed the grace period herself and stirred unrest through Willin, the representative of the underachieving students, someone with a deep grudge against the Academy and everything Ophelis Hall represented. Now a mob had gathered outside the building, torches in hand. Lortel had already secured the support of the head maid and several administrators. What she needed now was destruction. If the students damaged the hall, the Academy, already struggling financially, would be forced to sell off assets to cover repairs. And that included the sage's sealed tome, the crown jewel of the Academy. Watching the storm from the window, Lortel thought back to her childhood in the slums. All the scheming and manipulation, had it only been to survive. She always worked from the shadows. Some called her a mastermind. The mob outside Ophelis Hall was growing louder, demanding fair treatment. In the original plot, the occupation of Ophelis Hall had to be stopped by the protagonist. They had to confront the rioters and push through a series of mid-bosses orchestrated by Lortel. Inside the building, a hooded figure crept through the halls and came up behind a maid preparing to report the gathering to the head maid. Before she could react, the figure threw a bag over her head and dragged her away. That role belonged to Decoy Totter, one of the mid-bosses. He had been humiliated in a mock battle by Taylor and didn't need much convincing to take part in the scheme. First, he was to silence the maid, then he would open the front doors and let the students rush in. After that, his job was to stall the protagonist on the ground floor while the rest of the damage was done. As the crowd poured inside, Willin approached the hooded figure at the entrance and froze. He hadn't expected to see Ed. This role had originally gone to someone else. So how did he end up as a mid-boss? 2 days earlier, Ed was out hunting as usual when he noticed something. Too many people were dropping by his camp. Bellmeyer foraged nearby. Ziggs used the area for training. Even the princess's knight had been watching from a distance, thinking Ed hadn't noticed. Among all the visitors, 3 stood out. Lucy, the genius mage, who usually dropped in without warning, sometimes falling from the sky. Yenneka, who Ed didn't mind. She visited almost daily, helped tidy up, offered useful tips like better ways to clean his clothes, and never overstayed her welcome. And lastly, Lortel. She had come to recruit him for her next scheme. Ed wasn't interested. He already knew this was the start of the main plot of Act 2, and he had no intention of getting involved. Then she mentioned something unexpected. Totter was out of commission. Ed froze. What happened? Lortel explained Totter had tried to pick a fight with Taylor, but before he could get far, he called him worse than Ed. That's when Ziggs stepped in and punched him hard enough to knock him out. Even Elvira said she'd never seen Ziggs so angry. Ed's eyes widened. In the game's story, Totter was supposed to insult Taylor and get hit by him, not Ziggs. That would have driven him to join Lortel for revenge, but this time the script had already changed. Lortel laid out her plan. She needed someone inside Ophelis Hall before the protest. All Ed had to do was sneak in, stay hidden, and open the door when the students arrived. She said she needed someone she could trust. Ed figured that really meant someone with a ruined reputation, someone like him. Didn't they kick him out of Ophelis Hall? Didn't he want revenge? He told her no. He wasn't interested in revenge, but he'd hear her offer. She promised 20 gold coins. They shook on it. Ed already knew what this was about. Lortel wanted the students to wreck the luxury dorm. That would force the academy, already struggling, to sell the sage's sealed tome. According to the story, her plan would work. She'd go on to found a company within the academy, setting up a power struggle between her and the idealistic student council. The outcome would depend on which side the protagonist joined. All Ed had to do was side with the one most likely to win. That evening, Ed sat beneath a tarp near the campfire watching the rain soak the forest. Yenneka showed up, drenched and out of breath. She dropped beside him with a sigh, stretching her hands toward the fire. She said it must be hard living like this all the time. Ed said it wasn't so bad. She mentioned she'd need to move everything out of her Ophelis Hall room soon. With the next semester not far off, she wanted to start early. But her new room, shared with several students, was far smaller. She began listing off things she wouldn't have room for. Extra pillows, a rug, a lantern. She asked if he wanted any of it. Ed smiled and nodded. Sounded good to him. She raised her arms in a cheer and promised to bring them once she finished moving. Then she looked toward the cabin's roof. Lucy was standing there in the rain, perfectly still, staring off into the distance. Yenneka asked if she was always like that. Ed said sometimes. He looked up at Lucy. All that power came at a price. She pretended to be lazy, but deep down she was running from something. On rainy days like this, even she couldn't ignore it. He turned back to Yenneka and told her to ignore her. She seemed happy with that answer. Then Ed asked her something else. He knew the next big event was coming. Ophelis Hall would be sealed with wards to trap the students in their rooms. But someone like Yenneka could break through. He asked if she could meet him tomorrow night around 9 in the Rose Garden. Yenneka's face turned bright red as she repeated the words to herself. The Rose Garden. Ed had to keep her away. If she got involved, she'd ruin Lortel's plan before it even began. Yenneka jumped up, said she'd be there, and ran off, embarrassed. The night of the event arrived. Ed made his way to Ophelis Hall through the heavy rain. One of the maids already working with Lortel met him at the back entrance. He asked where the others were, and she explained that most were gathered with the head maid, just as planned. They'd be sealed in with the rest of the staff before the protest began. She also handed him what he'd requested, a bucket filled with a slick, flammable oil. Now standing at the stairs with the bucket by his side, Ed glanced at the wards around the building. Everything was in place. Outside, the students were shouting louder, with torches burning bright through the rain. The protest had begun. The moment arrived. The doors creaked open, and standing there was a hooded figure, a tied-up maid slung over his shoulder. Willin, the representative of the underachieving students, stepped forward and stopped in surprise. It was Ed. Ed cleared his throat and launched into his pre-prepared speech. He placed a hand on Willin's shoulder and solemnly stated that he had always agreed with his cause. Getting kicked out of Ophelis Hall had opened his eyes. He finally understood how unfair things were. Willin teared up and apologised for ever doubting him. He had no idea Ed was such a good person. Ed, maintaining the act, pushed him forward and told him to hurry upstairs. As Willin rushed off, Ed thought to himself that the man would likely take the fall for all this. He felt a little bad, but told himself Willin was only fighting for what he believed in. Ed moved through the halls, double-checking the wards. The maid he'd tied up had slipped away during his talk with Willin, but it didn't matter. The doors were already open. The damage had begun. From the main entrance behind him, Lortel stepped through the open doorway. She gave him a nod and said she knew she could count on him. Lortel told Ed they needed to begin before the staff showed up. As she passed, he wished her luck. She paused on the stairs and asked if he'd ever taken a life. He said no. She laughed and said she hadn't either, then admitted she'd done a lot of bad things she had to do to survive. People had nicknamed her the Golden Daughter. It sounded noble, but she didn't think she deserved it. After a moment, she asked Ed if someone like her could ever be pitied. He told her no. She should take responsibility for her actions. She sighed, smiled, and asked forgiveness for her moment of weakness before heading upstairs, saying there wasn't much time left. Ed dropped into his chair. Lortel was heading to Elris to discuss the next stage, overloading the dorm wards and handing the activation to Willin. Once he absorbed the spell's energy, he would become the 4th floor boss Taylor needed to defeat. Ed's job now was simple. Delay them just long enough for it to happen. He stretched and waited. In the Rose Garden, Yenneka sat alone inside the gazebo, rain pouring down. A grand carriage passed by, making her wonder who it could be. She read Ed's note. Something had come up. He'd be a little late. Blushing, she played with her hair clip, wondering if she'd chosen the right colour. Then she decided to run back and change it. Outside Ophelis Hall, Taylor, Ayla and Elvira arrived. Elvira was livid. If her alchemy reagents were disturbed, her work would be ruined. Taylor asked Ayla to calm her down, but she said it was no use. Elvira stormed ahead, thinking of reckless students throwing her potions around. She kicked open the door, and Ed was there, sitting alone in the centre of the lobby, quietly waiting at the base of the stairs. Taylor demanded to know what he was doing. Elvira saw the footprints and realised the other students had already gone up. She stepped in front of Taylor and smirked. She hadn't expected this. Was Ed seriously trying to block them? He raised his head, apologised, and said they couldn't go further. Elvira laughed. Did he really think he could stop the 3 of them with basic spells? Between her, Ayla's magic, and Taylor's swordsmanship, they had the upper hand. Taylor stepped forward and asked why Ed was doing this. What was going on upstairs? Ed didn't answer. Taylor narrowed his eyes. If Ed wouldn't talk, he'd make him. He drew his sword and charged. Ed stood up and hurled his chair, which Taylor cut in two. Ed followed with a wind slash aimed at the ceiling, shattering the chandelier above and sending it crashing down in a storm of glass and metal. Inside his locked room, Clevius jumped at the sound and nervously asked what was going on. Dust filled the air. Taylor shouted to check if the others were okay. Ayla responded, then Elvira shouted back too, "Fine!" Searching for Ed. Suddenly another wind slash whipped past her, slicing a piece of her hair. Her potion bag dropped. She stared at Ed. This wasn't a joke anymore. Something serious was happening upstairs. She reached for a potion, but Ed cast Ignite, surrounding her in fire. Her eyes widened. He was clever and precise with his magic. She cursed Ziggs. He really should have warned her how good Ed actually was. Without her alchemy bag or any enchanted tools, Elvira stood exposed. Most alchemists wore rings or necklaces to cast spells quickly, but she had always relied on her own skill. Now she regretted that. Ed had aimed for the chandelier, scattered her potions, and raised a wall of fire between them. Was all of it part of a plan to separate her from her tools? But if so, why hadn't he just gone for her directly? It didn't matter. This was Ed Rothstaler. They weren't going to lose to him. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a glowing blue orb. One last trick. She tossed it down, summoning a rabbit spirit, then quickly chanted an enhancement, fire resistance, berserk mode. The rabbit swelled in size, twisting into a monstrous form. Across the room, Ayla stepped forward, raising her hand to extinguish the flames, then froze as a wind slash sliced toward her. Taylor jumped in front to shield her, sword raised. He shouted for her to stay focused. Ed was targeting Ayla, keeping them from closing in. As Ed dealt with the beast, Taylor advanced. Elvira wrapped herself in her coat and dove through the burning wall, making it to her scattered potions. She grabbed her bag and hugged it close, cradling one of the vials with a soft sigh of relief. Ed cut down the rabbit and raised his hand to cast another spell, but Elvira moved quicker. She hurled a potion upward, and Ed's spell struck it mid-air, shattering the vial with a crack and releasing a pale mist that spread quickly. The moment it spread, the magic in the air was snuffed out. Casting anything became impossible. No more spells. Elvira, clutching her bag tight, stared him down. She said it was over. He couldn't use magic. And they still had a swordsman. She shouted to Taylor. He charged, but Ed ran the other way, knocking over a bookcase. A bucket of oil spilled, feeding the flames. Taylor coughed. It reeked of oil. Elvira was shocked. Why would there be oil in Ophelia's hall? Taylor said he could cut through the flames with elemental slash. The anti-magic mist wouldn't linger long. Gritting his teeth, he charged forward, determined to end it. Elvira warned him Ed could still have more tricks. But Taylor didn't stop. Ed drew his bow. Taylor braced himself, but the arrow flew past, its real target, Ayla. Elvira's eyes widened. Ayla couldn't defend herself. She activated claw fingers, a device that grabbed small objects. The arrow stopped mid-air. Instead of a sharp tip, the arrow carried a small cloth pouch tied to the shaft, clearly never meant to harm. Ed wasn't aiming to hurt them. Taylor swung down, blade arcing toward Ed. With calm precision, Ed lifted his bow and knocked the strike aside. Then a muffled boom echoed upstairs. Ed looked up. The second-floor boss, Clevius, had escaped. It was time. He lowered his guard and took the hit. Taylor slammed him into the wall with a heavy thud. Then Taylor grabbed him by the collar and demanded to know what this was all about. Elvira stood in silence, replaying everything in her head. Ed could have ambushed them long ago, but he hadn't. He waited, allowed them in, even pulled his punches. None of it made sense. Not unless he never meant to stop them in the first place. Still pinned to the wall, Ed looked up and asked if he was done. Taylor froze. The words caught him off guard. Without thinking, he let go. Ed straightened and told them to quit yapping and head upstairs. The three of them stood there, stunned. After all that, he was just letting them go. Elvira stepped forward. Something felt off. Why hadn't he fought them seriously? Taylor didn't get it. She asked again, quietly but firmly. Ed said nothing. Then the door creaked open. Yenneka stepped inside, rain trailing from her cloak as her hood fell back. Intense magical energy poured out of her, filling the room with a suffocating pressure that made the air feel heavier with every breath. The others looked back at her. Then her voice rang out, low, steady, and dangerous. She asked what they thought they were doing. Yenneka knew something wasn't right the moment she read Ed's note. It felt like he was trying to keep her out of something big, something dangerous. She'd been sitting alone in the rose garden, worrying over a broken hair clip while he was here, fighting desperately in Ophelia's hall. Her fingers clenched around the clip until it cracked in her palm. She marched into the hall and demanded to know what was going on. Taylor glanced back, clearly surprised to see her. He admitted he was glad she'd come. Ophelia's hall had been overrun by angry students. But before he could explain more, Elvira stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. She told Taylor to take a closer look at Yenneka's aura. Yenneka was the enemy. The ground trembled under her feet as she approached. Each step added weight to the pressure already choking the room. Ed shouted, an attempt to stop her, but she ignored it. She gave him a soft, almost gentle smile, then promised she'd handle everything. The atmosphere shifted in an instant. Windows shattered as Yenneka summoned her full force. Spirits of every element flooded the room. Mid-rank, low-rank, fluid spirits, an entire army responding to her call. Elvira gasped, recognizing the scale of the summoning. No one could win against this. She shouted at Taylor to fall back. They didn't stand a chance. They'd barely managed to deal with Ed. Yenneka was on another level entirely. Taylor hesitated as he faced Yenneka with his sword drawn. He wasn't one to back down. The spirits closed in and readied their attack. Suddenly, Ed grabbed him by the collar from behind and threw him toward the stairs. Ed's interjection pulled him away from Yenneka's attack at the last minute. Taylor landed hard, dazed. Looking up, he saw Ed standing between him and the spirits. Ed told him to move, get to the second floor. He'd handle Yenneka. Ayla rushed to his side, clearly confused. Ed had been trying to stop them. Why help them now? Elvira gave a weak, uncertain laugh. He couldn't stop all those spirits. It was impossible. Then something hit her in the head. Ed tossed her reagent bag back toward her and apologized for slicing the strap earlier. Still rattled, she fumbled for it. She asked him what he thought he was doing, ordering her around like that. But she didn't argue. She followed Taylor and Ayla up the stairs. Ed started walking toward Yenneka. Yenneka, surprised, asked him to step aside while she took care of things. He could explain the situation later while she treated his wounds. Ed raised his hands and placed them gently on her shoulders, telling her he was fine. She froze, clearly flustered, as she realized Ed's hands were on her shoulders. He asked her to please dismiss the spirits. He was having trouble staying upright with all the wind swirling around them. Yenneka apologized and released them. The pressure in the room vanished, the air settling back into stillness. On the stairs, the others turned around. They froze mid-step. Elvira stared. He'd actually stopped her. Ed turned slightly and waved them off, then collapsed. A few minutes later, Ed was propped up against the wall, still trying to catch his breath. Yenneka sat beside him, watching quietly. Then she asked why he kept doing this, why he always let himself get hurt like this. She reminded him that he didn't have to carry everything alone. He could rely on her. Ed gave a tired smile. He said he had his reasons, and that he'd explain them, just not right now. Yenneka muttered that they went too far. They didn't have to beat him up that badly. She said she'd give them a piece of her mind the next time she saw them. Then she glanced back at him and made him promise, no more of this. No more getting hurt like this. Ed thanked her for worrying. Then he thought to himself that his role here was done. He'd done what he could. It was time to head back to camp. Then Yenneka mentioned something. While waiting earlier in the rose garden, she'd noticed something strange. A carriage had passed by. She hadn't thought much of it at first until she noticed the golden crown on the roof. Ed's eyes widened. A golden crown? That wasn't just any carriage. That was the symbol of the Elt Company's head, the Golden King. Lortel's adoptive father, the man who had murdered her real parents, the one who, in the second act of the story, would eventually be defeated by Lortel in a power struggle for the sage's sealed tome, then disappear from the narrative altogether. He had no reason to be here now, but he was. And far too early. The story was changing, and Ed wasn't prepared for it. From the 5th floor window of Ophelis Hall, Lortel looked down at the carriage parked outside. She tapped her nails against the sill and sighed. Elris stood quietly beside her. Lortel said she'd been rejected, by the boy who looked so obviously evil and wicked. Elris raised an eyebrow. Did she mean Master Ed? Then she added that he didn't seem like Lortel's type. Lortel gave a faint smile. He wasn't bad-looking, but that wasn't it. She thought they were alike, both willing to do whatever it took to survive, just like her and Elris. She sighed again. People like them would probably face rejection for the rest of their lives. Elris remained silent. She had spent over 20 years at Ophelis Hall, starting her training at just 15 and quickly rising to become head maid at a remarkably young age. Lortel had spent a fortune to win her loyalty, believing every coin was worth it. Because Elris was someone like herself, someone who had sacrificed values and ideals for wealth. Only people like herself could ease the loneliness she felt. Growing up in the slums, Lortel learned one rule: trust no one, or you'll be betrayed. That was the harsh reality she had to live with. As they walked through the halls, Lortel told her everything was going to plan. All she had to do now was hide in a storage room and play the role of a frightened student who ran and hid when things got too dangerous. Elris sighed, then drew her sword. Lortel froze as the cold blade touched the side of her neck. Elris's voice was quiet but clear. They were nothing alike. On the 2nd floor, Taylor's group had finally caught up with Clevius. After some resistance and a bit of force, they managed to drag him along as an unwilling ally. With his reluctant help, they cleared the 3rd floor, defeating the maid posted there with little difficulty. Then they reached the 4th floor. Only the 1st floor boss, Ed, had truly slowed them down. The deeper they moved into Ophelis Hall, the worse the atmosphere became. Something was wrong. The air vibrated with unstable mana. Students ran past them in a panic, some tripping over each other, others screaming. Then they saw him. Willen stood at the far end of the hall, surrounded by a storm of violent magical energy. Arcs of power pulsed around him, scorching the walls. His arms trembled as he tried to contain the power surging through his body. He shouted at them for help. He couldn't control it anymore. This had been part of the plan all along for Willen, but things were spiralling out of control. The students were at risk, some even jumping from windows to escape. Taylor deflected a burst of energy with his sword and shouted to Elvira. Did she have any of the mana-blocking powder left? She shook her head. She told him it wouldn't work. While it disrupted mana, it couldn't affect the magic circles that now consumed Willen. Instead, she dug into her reagents and pulled out a potion. An anglerfish potion. She uncorked it and poured its glowing contents across the floor. It shimmered, then spread like mist across the corridor. A barrier formed, a thin but sturdy wall that would shield them and the students behind them from weaker magical attacks. With the backline protected, she grabbed Clevius and kicked him through the barrier toward Willen. She ordered Taylor and Clevius to go and knock Willen out. Clevius stumbled forward toward the storm. Taylor followed immediately. They sprinted through the hallway, bouncing off walls and dodging exploding chunks of debris, making their way toward the source of the chaos. The closer they got, the more intense the pressure became. Finally, they reached Willen. He gave a shaky laugh of relief. Then, all the windows of Ophelis Hall exploded on the 4th floor. Taylor and Clevius managed to defeat Willen. Outside, Ed watched the carriage from the edge of the trees, staying hidden as the windows exploded. Yenneka asked if he should move, but Ed said he was okay despite his injuries. The carriage had been sitting there for a while, but no one had come out yet. Ed wondered why a man like the Golden King would arrive under the cover of darkness in such a plain carriage. On any other day, he'd arrive with a flashy parade, but this quiet arrival meant he didn't want anyone to know he was here. Ed thought the Golden King shouldn't be here yet, so what had changed? What was he up to? Then a maid stepped toward the carriage, holding an umbrella. He recognised her instantly. Shani. One of the maids of Ophelius Hall, an orphan, raised under Elris's care. She should have been upstairs with her twin sister. Ed's chest tightened. Shani would never betray Elris, which could only mean Elris had betrayed Lortel. The plan was falling apart. Smoke residue still hung in the air as Elta finally stepped through the entrance of Ophelius Hall. Flanked by cloaked men, he walked with quiet purpose. No fanfare, no grand entrance, just deliberate silence and cold authority. Left behind in the carriage was the charred remnant of a note, still faintly smouldering. The letter had exposed everything: Lortel's betrayal, her knowledge of her parents' murder, her hidden alliances with rival merchants and rogue executives from within the Elty company. Her quiet bid to weaken his control by targeting the sage's sealed tome and creating a scandal large enough to draw attention from the main branch. The sender promised they had proof, and they were willing to sell it. It was Elris. Meanwhile, Elris, still holding her sword at Lortel's neck, pondered her choices. She needed the money now more than ever. Her eyesight was failing, and she had lost some of her hearing due to a past accident. Her time as headmaid was nearing its end. She had many people depending on her, and managed several orphanages, and was worried what would happen if she could no longer work. She told Lortel that she thought she was more clever than this, that a little speech about revenge hadn't moved her at all. In the end, both Elta and Lortel were the same. Then Elris sighed, realising she had become just like them too. Then the door exploded open. Taylor's group stormed in. Elvira saw the situation and shouted that the maid had taken a hostage. Elris, surprised, pointed her sword toward the group as Lortel fell forward the moment the blade left her neck. The group rushed to her as Taylor stood guard facing Elris. Lortel couldn't bring herself to speak. She thought she'd be able to say it, that Elris was the one behind this, that she'd betrayed her. But now, with the lump in her throat and tears slipping past her eyes, she could barely breathe. Elvira knelt beside her, stunned. She had never seen Lortel like this, so shaken, so human. What happened to her? Lortel thought she must look pathetic. She wiped tears from her face and ran down the stairs, covering her face. As she ran, she thought of Elta's arrival. Her plan to take him down was almost complete. The years of tax evasion and bribery were finally going to be exposed. All she had to do now was send a message to one of the executives at the main branch while Elta was away. She had a carrier pigeon in her room. She just had to get there, send the message, hide, and avoid capture. Then she slowed to a stop. She was prepared for betrayal. She'd experienced it countless times. So why was she breaking down like this? Her face was covered in tears, her body shaking. She composed herself and told herself that she just needed to make it through the night. As long as she could get that message out, she would be fine. Meanwhile, at the entrance of Ophelius Hall, Elta walked in through the main entrance, surrounded by his men, all wearing hooded cloaks. He stopped when he saw someone standing in front of the stairs. Ed was there, blocking the way. Elta told him he should evacuate with the other students. Ed calmly replied that he was here to stop anyone from entering the building. The explosions had made it dangerous. It could collapse at any moment. So until the academy staff arrived, he was keeping everyone out. Elta asked if the academy had instructed him to do this. Ed explained that he was acting on his own judgment, following standard protocol. He thought to himself that maybe he should have gone upstairs to help Lortel, but no, Taylor was up there. He should be able to reach her. Ed had faith in them. He knew they could do it. He'd seen it before when playing the game. He just needed to hold these men back. He couldn't let them reach Lortel. Then he acted like he'd just recognised Elta, politely asking if he was Master Elta Kehaland, the head of the Elta Company. He bowed, showing respect, and suggested contacting the Academy so Elta could receive a proper welcome. Elta stared down at him, eyes narrowing slightly. With a faint curl of his lip, he remarked that Ed must be working for Lortel. 10 minutes ago, Ed and Yenneka blew up the wall of Zig's dorm and found him mid-workout doing vertical push-ups. Ed asked why he hadn't fled with the others. Ziggs replied a collapsed building wouldn't kill him. Only a monster would think that, Ed thought. Ziggs stood up and asked why Ed had just destroyed his wall, complaining that the hole would let the draft in. Ed wondered who would think this musclehead was a mage. Ziggs introduced himself politely to Yenneka, since they'd never spoken before, and apologised for the glass can incident. Yenneka tried to say it was her fault, but Ed interrupted, telling her not to apologise since she'd already been punished. Yenneka nervously thanked Ed. Ziggs looked at them both and asked if they were dating. Yenneka jumped, denying it in shock. She glanced at Ed, who just stared at her. She wondered if she'd hurt his feelings by denying it so strongly. Ed told her not to worry, that Ziggs was the rude one. Ziggs bowed and apologised, then asked what brought them here. Ed said he needed a favour and would owe Ziggs one if he could help. Back to the present, Ed was still speaking with Elta at the entrance of a feeless hall, pretending to offer him a proper reception while Ziggs and Yenneka watched from the shadows. Elta narrowed his eyes, his suspicion growing. He leaned in slightly and asked if Ed had been charmed by Lortel's looks. A girl like her couldn't be trusted. She'd stab him in the back the moment he became useless. Then he made an offer, double whatever Lortel had promised him, if he would just step aside. Ed raised his head and replied calmly. He hadn't taken any payment from Lortel, so double of nothing was still nothing. Elta didn't like that answer. He raised a hand. All at once, the cloaked men around him unsheathed their swords. He gave the order to remove Ed quietly. Ed turned and ran, but more of them stepped in to block his path. A sudden gust of wind roared through the entrance, scattering the men. Nearby, Ziggs stood with one arm outstretched, having cast Wind Slash. Yenneka stood beside him, tense but ready. Ed called out to them, just hold the line and buy him some time. He'd owe them. Both Ziggs and Yenneka stepped forward, standing between the cloaked men and the stairs. As Ed ran up to the next floor, Ziggs shouted that he already owed him anyway. Elta's expression darkened. He warned his men not to underestimate the students. They might be young, but they weren't weak. With weapons drawn, they charged towards Ziggs and Yenneka. Ed ran up the stairs, his mind focused on one thing: finding Lortel. She had to know what was happening. Elta was here, and she was the target. He rushed through the winding corridors of a fearless hall until finally he spotted her hiding. He asked if she was all right, then motioned for her to follow him. They had no time to waste. Lortel ran behind him, but thoughts were swirling in her head. People always wanted something. No one ever helped without expecting something in return. That was the truth she'd grown up with. That was why she trusted Elris. And that was why betrayal hurt so much. She remembered the look Yenneka gave Ed once, a kind of affection that seemed so selfless, so genuine. A look that had never been directed at her. Maybe she had hoped for something like that from Elris. Maybe she had been a fool. She suddenly stopped in the hallway. Ed turned and asked what was wrong. Without knowing why, she blurted it out. She might not be able to pay him the 20 gold coins she promised. Things hadn't gone the way she planned. She regretted saying it immediately. He was the only person still helping her, and she just admitted she had nothing to offer. But Ed didn't seem bothered. He said he didn't care about the money. Then he grabbed her arm and pulled her along. They could talk about it later. Right now, they needed to avoid getting caught. Confused, she followed, trying to keep up. As they ran, Ed asked her to explain the situation. She told him there was a market manipulation scheme happening within the Elta Company's main branch. Her adoptive father was behind it. After a major monster clearing operation in the Eastern Mountains, the value of armour and equipment had plummeted. Her father planned to buy out the supply and monopolise it, then bounce the goods around internally to inflate their value. A classic insider trade. To fund the operation, he needed something big, like the sage's sealed tome. That's why he sent her to the academy. He wanted her to find a way to seize it. Ed pieced the rest together. She'd escalated the Ophelis Hall occupation to drive the academy into financial distress, forcing them to sell the book cheap. With Elta distracted and pulled away from the main branch, she'd have just enough room to collapse the scheme from within. Lortel was stunned. How could Ed understand it all so quickly? If that was her plan, then there was one thing left to do. Send the order to sell. Get word to her allies at the branch and crash the whole operation. She said she had a carrier pigeon in her room. That was how she'd been relaying instructions. Ed asked if a simple note would do, something like, "Sell?" She nodded. That was enough. But now her father was trying to capture her. If he got to her first, he'd force her to reveal everything. Ed told her to listen carefully. She needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere no one would see her. If he were her father, he'd have people stationed at both bridges off Akan Island. She had to find a stable hand and send out a decoy carriage to draw attention away. She asked what she should do afterward. Ed told her there was a cabin in the northern forest. He'd been building it himself. She could lay low there for a few days. Ed peered through a gap in the nearby door. Someone was standing just outside, watching the back exit. He quickly pulled Lortel to the sides and gripped her shoulders. He'd deal with the guard and get to her room to send the message. She needed to run, now. Keep out of sight and don't stop until she reached the forest. But Lortel froze. Could she really trust him? What was his angle? Ed tried to shake her out of it. Was she even listening? She finally snapped back and asked why he was doing all this for her. He looked at her. He saw the hesitation, the fear. Closing his eyes, he let out a breath. Did he really need a reason? He said he just felt like it. Then he turned and stepped through the door. Lortel leaned against the wall and slid down to the floor. Somewhere nearby, a loud noise rang out. Was it the clash with Elris upstairs? Or the fighting near the main entrance? No, it was close. She placed a hand over her chest. Her heart was racing. Ed stepped out into the rain. Just beyond the rear exit stood the maid, sword in hand. She hadn't expected him. She charged at him with her blade aimed low. Ed stomped down, catching her sword underfoot, stopping the strike cold. The same move as always. He remembered the pattern well. She quickly lifted her dress, revealing a belt of throwing knives. With one hand still gripping her sword, she tried to reach for them, but he grabbed her wrist, locking both arms. Then she used her trump card, Skillshare. Just once a day, she could borrow her twin's ability. The knives rose into the air under weak telekinesis and flew toward Ed. Two struck him. One in the side, one near the shoulder, but they didn't pierce deep. He pulled them free with one hand and shoved her to the ground. Pinned and furious, she screamed that she couldn't fail Elris. Ed told her it was over. She looked up over her shoulder and said he didn't understand what Elris meant to her, what they'd survived, the orphans they'd saved. Then a sudden boom shook the building. The 5th floor windows shattered behind him. He pressed down on the maid until she passed out. Her last words before going still were that she would never forgive him. He stood up and pulled her from the rain, then dragged her back inside. There were countless stories that never got told in the game. But he had one now. One about survival. Bleeding from the fight, Ed stumbled away from the building. The wounds weren't deep, but each step still hurt. He didn't stop. A system alert. New skill acquired. Pain endurance. He could now ignore pain and fatigue temporarily. He reached the side of the hall, picked up a rock, and smashed open the window to Lortel's room. Climbing inside, he paused. It suited her. Quietly elegant. He crossed to the cabinet and opened it. The carrier pigeon was still there, waiting. He scribbled the note, cell and tied it to the bird's leg, then opened the window again and let it go, watching it fly into the storm. The plan was now in motion. Ed left Lortel's room and made his way back toward the forest camp. The rain had let up, and blood still seeped from the knife wounds in his side and shoulder. He staggered down the trail, his body felt heavy. Thanks to Ziggs and Yenneka, Lortel had escaped. If everything had gone according to plan, she'd already be waiting at the cabin. Through the trees ahead, he spotted someone on the path, a hooded figure standing still. As he approached, the figure stepped into view. It was Lortel. He started to ask why she was out here, then noticed the knife in her hand. His mind snapped into focus. This was the perfect spot. Isolated, quiet. The Golden Daughter herself, staring right at the one loose end she couldn't buy off. His heart pounded. She walked toward him, slow and steady. He panicked and thought about running, but his body was done. She raised the blade, then stopped right in front of him. Ed braced himself for a strike, but it didn't come. Instead, she reached out, cut strips of fabric from her own coat, and began wrapping his wounds. He watched in silence, barely able to react. She asked if he really had to get this hurt. She slipped his arm over her shoulder and supported him as they made their way down the trail. She mentioned starting a fire at the camp. Then she told him he should warm up. Then they headed back together. Seated beside the fire, Ed asked Lortel if everything had gone according to her plan. She replied with calm confidence, reminding him she was Lortel Kehaland. The stable hand had even promised to risk his life to create a distraction, which made Ed curious about what she'd done to earn that kind of loyalty. He half suspected she'd threatened his family, but she didn't answer, and instead shifted the topic. If things worked out, she would be one of the leading candidates for the next head of the Elk Company. Having her in his debt, she teased, was a big deal. Ed just stared into the flames, unmoved, prompting her to call him boring. She thanked him anyway, saying she would never forget what he'd done. He told her to just repay what she owed, and they'd be even. She agreed without complaint, until her tone softened and she asked if he was close to Yenneka. Ed said he supposed so, calling her a good person. Lortel agreed, noting Yenneka's respectability, before quietly admitting she herself wasn't such a nice person. Meanwhile, at Ophelis Hall, Elta had abruptly left the fight midway through as if the battle no longer mattered. The mercenaries were skilled enough to be a threat even to Ziggs, but he was more concerned about his ally. She had been fine at first, but after receiving a message from a spirit, her magic began flaring violently. Ziggs tried to calm her, asking if she was all right, but she only smiled coldly, insisting she wasn't angry. The next day, Ziggs came to Ed's camp with a spare uniform and news. The previous night's destruction had been pinned mostly on Willen, while Elris was taken down by Taylor's group without exposing Lortel. Ed felt relieved. An important figure for later events had been preserved. Lortel's plan seemed to have worked. There was still no word from Elta. They could only wait for confirmation from the main branch. After being sidetracked, Ed had fallen behind on gathering supplies. His body still ached, but he had work to do. He already knew his next goals: secure a spirit contract and dismantle a magically engineered item. Yenneka appeared, cheerfully waving, saying she was getting some fresh air. He asked if she was hurt from helping him, but she said she was fine before casually asking how Lortel was doing. Inside, Lortel waited for word from the company. Being indoors didn't bother her. She was with Ed. His kindness and loyalty had a warmth no amount of gold could match, and she refused to lose it, not even to Yenneka. 3 days in the camp gave her the perfect chance to get ahead. She was deep in thought when suddenly Lucy appeared, asking her to move so she can sleep in her sunny nap spot. Lortel was still processing the intrusion when Ed carried Lucy outside and tossed her into the small stick hut, apologising for the disturbance. Lortel asked if Lucy came often. Ed said yes, calling her a force of nature. Yet another girl visiting his camp regularly, Lortel thought. Over the next days, she never managed time alone with Ed. Yenneka came every morning, Lucy always drifted in, and Ed worked steadily. He even built a fireplace for the cabin. That evening, they shared dinner, and Lortel promised his payment once she was safe. She asked if he wanted anything else. Ed asked for any broken or spare magically engineered items. Lortel agreed. Then he turned to Yenneka, asking if she could help him with elementalism and a spirit contract. She checked his resonance, summoning a small bird-like spirit named Charis. Charis began speaking to Yenneka. Flustered, the spirit told Yenneka that Ed needed to raise his resonance further to hear them clearly. Yenneka assured Charis that Ed was a fast learner, but the spirit protested, saying Ed didn't have the time to practice magic and that she knew it. According to their weekly report, his food stocks were low and he was behind on chores after recent events. Yenneka quickly dismissed the spirit before Ed could hear more, laughing nervously. Lortel then offered Ed discounted items if he visited the store regularly. Yenneka objected, saying Lortel should give them for free. Lortel laughed, saying she had to follow the merchant's code. The argument was interrupted by someone calling Lortel's name. A young woman in red approached, bowed, and apologised for the intrusion. Belle Meyer had been promoted to head maid and brought news from the former head maid. Belle glanced around at the three girls present, her thoughts drifting to an earlier conversation with Clara. Clara had quietly confessed that Yenneka seemed to like Ed. Belle had feigned surprise for politeness' sake. She had replied with mild concern, saying Clara must be worried for her friend. Clara admitted Ed had a questionable reputation, though it appeared to be improving, and as Yenneka's friend she would always side with her. Clara went on to say that wasn't the biggest issue. Yenneka was now caught up with Lortel. Both appeared to be vying for Ed's attention, and Clara worried Yenneka didn't stand a chance against someone as cunning. She also wondered how Ed could be so oblivious to Yenneka's interest when it seemed obvious to everyone else. As Belle hung the laundry, she remarked that perhaps Ed didn't have the time or energy for romance right now. Clara smirked and suggested the opposite, that maybe he enjoyed having two girls competing for him. She even teased that he might be a womanizer, though Belle found that hard to imagine. Back in the present, Belle rubbed her head at the situation. The whole thing felt less like a love triangle and more like trying to wrangle a mischievous cat, a curious kitten, and a stray all at once. Shaking off the thought, she focused as Lortel asked for the message she'd come to deliver. Belle bowed and delivered Elris's letter. Later that evening, Belle carried Lucy back to Ophelis Hall while Yenneka followed reluctantly. Ed tried on the uniform Ziggs had lent him while Lortel opened the long-awaited letter from the Elt Company's main branch. The message confirmed Elta's defeat. It was only a matter of time now. Ed asked if there was any chance Elta still had a card to play. Lortel admitted it was possible, though slim. Her ally Slog was backing her, and she trusted him to handle things on that end. Her main concern had been Miss Elris, but that matter seemed settled. The letter from Elris contained no accusations or blackmail, only a request to support several orphanages and related causes. Lortel hesitated, unsure whether to trust her after everything, yet instead of burning the letter, she smiled faintly and tucked it away. She decided to play along. Rising, Lortel said she should be leaving and asked Ed to stop by later to draw up a contract. He agreed and handed her a torch for the dark walk back. She lingered for a moment, looking at him, then remarked that he was taller than she'd realised. Ed asked what brought that on, but she only glanced away with a faint flush in her cheeks, saying she might be moving too quickly but wanted to go all out. Stepping closer, she reached for his tie, claiming it was crooked. Ed pointed out that there was no one to notice in the middle of the woods. Lortel insisted that it was always good to look presentable. After all, they were both students of Silvenia Academy. Then suddenly pulled him in and kissed him. When she stepped back, she touched her lips with a smile, saying the raspberries from earlier had been delicious and that it was nice to taste them again. Ed sighed, telling her she had crossed a line. She called him mean for playing hard to get and started down the path, only to trip and tumble into a bush. Ed straightened, slightly embarrassed by the scene. The story was twisting in directions he hadn't planned. All he wanted was to raise his stats and earn his diploma, nothing more. Summer gave way to autumn. Beneath the great spirit tree, Yenneka sat with a group of spirits as they brought her startling news. The vixen had kissed Ed. She blinked and asked them to repeat themselves. Takan confirmed it, calling the kiss passionate and claiming the vixen knew how to win a man's heart. Yenneka asked what Ed had done afterward. Takan said his expression had not changed at all. That either meant he didn't like women, or simply didn't like her that way. Yenneka quietly exhaled in relief. Takan didn't stop there, his voice rising as it warned her to be wary of the vixen and whatever tricks she might try next. The other spirits, growing tired of the noise, moved in to pull Takan away. One spirit reassured Yenneka that she was charming in her own way, but Takan broke free, rushed back, and urged her to use that innocence as a weapon. When asked what she wanted to do with Ed, Yenneka glanced aside, embarrassed, and admitted maybe something simple, like feeding each other. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Ed was by coincidence feeding Lucy with a spoon. She swallowed the broth, only for her eyes to widen before she declared it disgusting. Ed jotted down a note that he might need to add more spices, but Lucy smacked him from behind, telling him to stop using her as a test subject. He figured he would have to put off raising his cooking skill until he could find better ingredients. With the new term underway, Ed's survival training hours were cut down by the demands of schoolwork. Still, he kept an eye on Taylor and the 4 main female leads during his daily routines. Taylor was training diligently with Ayla nearby for support. The princess seemed fine for now, though her inevitable clash with Lortel was drawing closer. Clarice would not arrive until next year, so there was no need to worry yet. Lortel's own path was also holding steady. With those threads secure, Ed turned his focus toward the education district, already planning for the day he would have to face Professor Glast, the final boss of Act 2. Professor Glast reviewed a report on the Ophelis Hall incident, noting that someone might have orchestrated it from the shadows. His assistant, Cleo Elpin, had compiled the findings after some investigation. He praised her insight, then reminded her of the thesis on celestial magic he had requested, pointedly remarking that it was still missing. Cleo stiffened, forcing a polite assurance that it would be on his desk by morning. Back in her office, she slumped into her chair. A niece who worked under her had just dropped off fresh documents regarding the same case. Cleo thanked her and began to sort through the papers. They contained dossiers on several students, Ed, Ziggs, and Yenneka. Her eyes narrowed when she reached Ed's file, recalling that he had recently applied to work under her. The coincidence struck her as too much of a coincidence, her suspicion of him deepening. Elsewhere, Ed met with Lortel. She welcomed him with refreshments, wearing formal attire. When he asked about her appearance, she explained she had an important meeting that day, tucking her hair back and asking how she looked. His blank response left her faintly embarrassed, but she shifted the subject, asking about the cabin he was building. Ed said it was nearly finished, though he still lacked furniture. Lortel offered her wares, but he said they were too fine and costly. Placing a hand on a chair, she said she couldn't simply give things away. It went against the merchant's code. Then she cast a small spell, snapping one of its legs, and sighed that it no longer had any resale value. He could have it for free. Ed thanked her, though he still called the gift too valuable. Watching him, Lortel leaned close, noting how he never seemed swayed by her advances. Sitting on the table, she reminded him of the kiss she had given, claiming it had been her earnest attempt. She asked if he even saw her as a woman, pressing a finger to his chest, as she admitted she certainly saw him as a man. She confessed her helping him came from selfish motives, but cut him off before he could respond. She wasn't expecting an answer yet. Someday she would be. For all her poise as a merchant, her finger trembled slightly, betraying her inexperience in love. Later, Yenneka introduced Ed to the basics of elementalism. She summoned a small fire spirit who saluted him and loudly declared itself ready for duty. The spirit called itself Mug, boasting it had been the top candidate in Yenneka's rigorous trials. Its boundless energy quickly became overwhelming, reminding Ed more of a soldier than a companion. Still, when Yenneka asked him to hold it, the spirit's warmth spread through his palms like a portable heater. Yenneka watched him carefully, glad to see he was satisfied with his new partner. She offered to guide him, then caught herself rambling and tried to compose her expression. Pretending to be aloof, she claimed she was too busy to help for free. Ed, taking her seriously, apologised and suggested paying her for her time. She instantly refused, stepping close and insisting he needed that money to survive. Friends, she argued, didn't put a price on favours. When Ed dryly pointed out that she had just asked for something in return, her composure cracked. She flustered, muttering that her friend Clara always accused her of being too generous. Ed answered that she wasn't wrong. Her face warmed as she stammered that she wasn't generous with just anyone, before quickly excusing herself. She waved as she left, urging him to come to her if he ever needed help. Ed, still puzzled, waved back. Over the following days, Ed dismantled several magically engineered items, unlocking the skill to craft his own. The cabin was improving, now with furniture, a fireplace, a mug doubling as both companion and heat source whenever firewood ran short. For the first time, Ed felt as though he had a home. Evening came quickly, and soon it was time to check the traps he had set. Unbeknownst to him, Cleo Elpin was already moving through the forest. She had heard rumours of Ed living in these woods, and had her own suspicions about his connection to Ophelis Hall. A noise ahead froze her steps. She hid behind a tree, peering out carefully. Her breath caught. Ed emerged, dragging a deer in one hand while carrying an unconscious Lucy slung casually over his shoulder. Cleo's heart pounded as she covered her mouth, desperate to stay silent. Her gaze fixed on Lucy. That girl, someone so powerful even the headmaster would struggle against, had been subdued and carried off without a trace of resistance. In Cleo's mind, the conclusion was unavoidable. Ed must have been the mastermind behind Ophelis Hall all along. Cleo shadowed Ed through the forest, careful to remain unseen until he reached his camp. He dragged a deer across the ground, Lucy slung limply over his shoulder. Without hesitation, he tossed her into the stick shack, dropped the deer nearby, and headed off to bed. Seeing her chance, Cleo crept toward the shack. She reached out, ready to free Lucy, only for the girl to vanish in a blur and reappear behind her, eyes sharp and body tense. Lucy demanded to know who she was. Cleo introduced herself as the assistant professor, but Lucy flashed past her again, slipping back into the shack. She crouched inside, her back turned, almost like an animal retreating to its den. Confused, Cleo hesitated, then saw Lucy turn with a strip of jerky in her mouth, watching her warily. Before Cleo could speak again, Lucy shot straight into the air and disappeared into the night sky. The next day in Professor Glass's office, Cleo wasted no time asking if he had ever heard of Ed Rothstaler, the disowned boy. Without looking up from his book, Glass replied that he didn't remember the names of talentless trash. Cleo pressed on, insisting this was the same student who had subdued Lucy May Reel. She started to recount what she had witnessed, but the professor cut her off, saying her story was nonsense. She admitted then that she had gone to Ophelis Hall herself and used thoughtography magic to record the events. When he asked if she had gotten permission, she admitted no, she had fabricated an excuse. Glass told her to prepare an apology letter immediately. Cleo assured him she already had one drafted, confident she would be pardoned once they saw the recording. She activated the glowing orb on his desk, showing Ed waiting in the hall for Taylor's group. She insisted his expression was clearly that of a mastermind. The professor sighed, asking if this was all she had. Cleo tried to remind him that Ed had carried off Lucy. He asked if she was sure Lucy hadn't simply been asleep. She faltered, realising she hadn't considered that. He dismissed her with orders to bring the written apology. Alone, Glass kept watching the thoughtograph. He saw Taylor's group arrive, just as reports had claimed. Ed would be swiftly defeated by the skilled swordsman and the prodigy alchemist Elvira. A normal student could never match such opponents. Yet as the fight played out, Glass found himself leaning closer. Ed had still managed to endure longer than expected, displaying adaptability and stubborn resilience that caught the professor's attention. Meanwhile, in the forest, a sudden explosion echoed through the trees. Ed had just tested his ornamental dagger, now infused with explosive spiritual magic. He examined it with satisfaction. The once useless blade now held real power. Mug praised him with wild enthusiasm, piling on exaggerated compliments until Ed lost patience. He seized the small spirit by its wing and held it up to eye level. Mug froze, trembling, and asked what he had done wrong. Ed told him to stop babbling and cut the needless formalities. Narrowing his eyes, he asked why the spirit was so desperate to please him. Had someone promised him something? Mug stammered, then burst into tears. Between sobs, he confessed that Yenneka had promised him refined magic if he formed a contract with Ed, an incentive that would help him grow stronger. His motives weren't of pure loyalty, but ambition. When Ed pressed further, Mug admitted that after studying him, he had concluded Ed had an authoritative presence, so he tried his hardest to keep him happy. Ed told him he understood. Everyone was simply doing what they had to in order to survive. Mug sniffled in relief, but asked if he could still address him formally. Ed shrugged and said to do whatever was most comfortable, then started back toward the cabin. Later that evening, Ed sat by the fire reviewing his situation. His combat skills were still lacking, but daily labour had built his body beyond the strength of the average man. His food stores were stocked, classes were under control, and while the workload was draining, life was steadier than before. As fatigue overcame him, he drifted asleep. A faint voice stirred him awake, someone softly calling his name. Blinking, he saw Yenneka standing in front of him, her face full of concern. She asked if he was all right. He apologised for spacing out. She urged him not to push himself too hard. He then remembered the letters he had received that day. 2 were expected, one from the Academy, another from the Elder Company. But the third signalled the story had already diverged from its course. This chapter was meant to centre on a dispute between the Academy and Elte over the sage's sealed tome. Yet with Elte's collapse, another contender had stepped forward. Crepin Rothstaler. Crepin planned to seize the tome for his immortality research, even though he was meant to appear much later in the story. As a boss, he was far beyond the student's ability to face. Ed knew he had to prevent him from interfering at all costs. The letter detailed Crepin's movements and ended with an invitation. The sender was none other than Princess Penia. Back on campus, the princess sipped tea in the square. Her butler arrived, reporting that the letter had been delivered to the northern forest. She thanked him, then turned to her knight. She asked how Crepin could have learned of the negotiations for the tome. The knight suggested that perhaps Ed was feeding information back to his family, hoping to be recognised again. A voice interrupted from behind, calling it doubtful. Lortel approached, servants unfolding a table and chair for her as she sat opposite the princess. She remarked that the accusation was bold, but most likely it had been her father who informed Crepin. The princess looked surprised. Lortel explained that Crepin had originally requested Elle to acquire the tome for a generous price, though she had not realised the significance at the time. Even now, with Elta gone, the company still intended to purchase it. The princess asked if that meant she would sell the tome to House Rothstaler. Lortel replied that she had no intention of doing so, and that she herself would never associate with her father's customers. When asked why she was revealing this, Lortel said the enemy of her enemy was her friend. She also wanted to keep House Rothstaler in check. And for one more selfish reason, Ed. She didn't want him caught in the middle of it all. The princess narrowed her eyes, asking if she was truly worried for him. Lortel answered that Ed was already burdened enough, living in the forest, and to use his family name against him now was unfair. The princess studied her carefully. Was Lortel's concern genuine, or another ploy? She then said Ed could still be useful. If he refused to help, she would command him if necessary. At that, Lortel lowered her cup onto the table, her body trembled. A moment later, she burst into laughter, asking if the princess truly believed she held such power. The princess's knight shouted at Lortel for speaking so boldly, but Penia stopped him with a raised hand. Her eyes stayed on Lortel. Lortel stood, straightened her clothes, and gave one last warning. If the princess tried to use Ed, she might find herself being used instead. The knight moved again, but Penia silenced him once more. As Lortel left, the princess kept watching her. Crepin Rothstaler's sudden appearance was a problem, but what unsettled her most was the girl who had shown no fear before royalty. She wondered if Lortel had ever once felt powerless. At company headquarters, Lortel found Ed and Yenneka waiting. She greeted them warmly, saying she only had tea prepared for two. She offered Yenneka water instead. Yenneka laughed, pointing out there had been plenty of tea in the break room, but since she wasn't a paying customer, she didn't mind. Ed slid the tea toward Yenneka, saying he would take the water instead. Lortel's shoulders stiffened, a faint tremor running through her posture as she looked out the window. The irritation was clear, but she quickly forced it down before leading them to a shelf lined with magical goods. Yenneka's eyes went wide. Everything looked brand new. She asked about the merchant's code. Was Lortel really allowed to give these away? Lortel told her to look closer. Yenneka leaned in and spotted a tiny scratch on one. Her eyes narrowed. Had Lortel damaged them on purpose? Lortel laughed it off. Ed thanked her, though admitted he felt guilty taking them for free. She told him it was fine, as long as he came back every few days to renew his contract. The two of them started arguing again. Ed's body, however, had reached its limit. Their voices faded as his mind sank into heavy darkness. The room felt like deep water, their shapes fading above him like shadows seen through a lake's surface. The princess sat with a cup of tea, reflecting on Ed's time since being cast out of Ophelis Hall. He had survived in the forest, even taken part in the glass can incident, and since then had caused no disruptions. Instead, his grades had steadily risen, his work at the academy improving to the point he almost seemed like a model student. Perhaps her earlier judgment of him had been too harsh. Still, she had to be sure he wasn't tied to Crepin. She had already sent an invitation for a meeting the following day. She asked if Ed had accepted, and the knight reported that he would not be able to attend any time soon. When she pressed for the reason, the answer froze her hand mid-motion. Ed had collapsed from overwork. She lowered her cup in silence. At the cabin, Ed woke slowly. His chest felt heavy, breath shallow, and warmth spread across his stomach. He opened his eyes to find Lucy lying on top of him, mumbling about something being too salty in her sleep. He tried to sit up and asked if she was really dreaming about jerky, but he couldn't move. She was light, so it wasn't her weight, it was his own weakness. Lucy yawned, stating he was finally awake. She pressed a glowing hand to his stomach, saying he had thrown his magic balance off by training without enough rest. When he asked if she had been doing this the whole time, she admitted it was easy, though boring, and she had fallen asleep sometimes. Her tone then grew heavier. Yenneka and Lortel had been annoying, but he had needed help, so she hadn't minded. Still, she told him not to get sick again. Sometimes people died that way. Ed thanked her. From outside, a voice called that he was awake. Zig stepped in, carrying a bundle of wood, and said he'd started the fire outside. Lucy flushed, sprang off Ed, and shot up through the chimney into the sky. Ziggs raised an eyebrow and asked how many girls came to the cabin. Then, after a pause, he mused that Ed was a strong man, attracting women made sense, and wondered aloud if this was how civilization worked. Ed asked why he was here. Ziggs explained that Yenneka and Lortel were busy, so he had come to help. When Ed asked about his hair, Ziggs said he'd grown it out now that summer was over. He sat by the bed, offering Ed a spoonful of soup. It wasn't good, and Ziggs apologised, saying it was the best he could manage. He would have asked Elka or Clara, but Lortel had barred any other girls from visiting. Wanting to check the story's progress, Ed asked about minor events that should have happened. Ziggs confirmed that Taylor had handled them. That meant only the battle for the sage's sealed tome remained, Ed thought. Ed then asked how long he'd been unconscious. 10 days, Ziggs replied. Ed sat up, lifted the soup bowl and drank it down in one go, realising he'd been out far too long. He told Ziggs to send a message to Lortel right away. The battle for the tome was about to begin. At the negotiations sat Princess Penia Lortel Kehaland representing the Elter Company, and the man who should not have been part of this act, Crepin Rothstaler, head of House Rothstaler and the final boss of Act 4. The negotiations began with a formal meal. Crepin sat across from the princess, his tone polite and composed. He expressed regret for the trouble caused by a former member of his family and hoped that accepting her request to disown him would bring her some peace. He added that he had wanted to apologise in person before, but had not been able to until now. The princess calmly reassured him. Outwardly, Crepin appeared noble, dignified, and benevolent, yet her ability saw through the facade. He was undeniably a villain. Crepin then turned his attention to Lortel. Introducing himself with composure, he received a respectful bow as she introduced herself as the daughter of Elter Kehaland. He remarked that she must have inherited her father's judgment and ambition. Lortel smiled, saying that wherever profit could be found, she would always be there. The negotiations for the sage's sealed tome were divided into 3 stages. The first was the meal, a chance for participants to quietly gauge one another. The second was the inspection of the tome. The third was the bidding, where each party would submit only a single written offer, with the highest bids securing victory. The tome was one of Silvenia Academy's most treasured items, and secrecy was vital to protect the school's reputation. The princess believed Crepin would win. Lortel would never risk more than what could guarantee profit, while Crepin sought the tome for his own ambitions. If he simply bid slightly above market value, he would secure it. During the meal, Lortel herself had admitted she followed to profit wherever it led. To the princess, that meant, if Crepin bid more than 8,100 gold, victory was his. When the time came, the deputy headmaster collected the sealed slips of parchment and thanked them both. The first slip read, Crepin Rothstaler, 8,500 gold. The princess nodded, exactly as she expected. Then came the second slip, Lortel Kehaland, 9,400 gold. The princess's eyes widened. Lortel had bid far higher than anyone seeking profit would dare. The deputy headmaster declared Lortel the winner. Rising gracefully, Lortel bowed. Crepin's demeanour cracked. Clicking his tongue, he stood with a cold expression and announced his departure. The princess's thoughts raced. If Lortel wasn't acting for profit, then perhaps her aim was to keep the tome out of Crepin's hands. She remembered their earlier talk when Lortel claimed they shared the same enemy. That wasn't Lortel's nature. She wasn't the type to act for justice. Which meant she had an ally. Someone who already knew the truth about Crepin. Her memory flashed to that moment again, when Lortel had told her to keep Ed out of it. The realization struck her. Ed had been fighting House Rothstaler all along. She stumbled, nearly falling, as the thought overwhelmed her. Her knight asked if she was unwell, but she waved him off. Guilt consumed her. In her vendetta against Ed, she had driven an innocent man into despair. What had she done? Back at the Kehalan Company's base, Lortel stood before a mirror, tilting her head as she debated which hair accessory to wear. Her expression was one of quiet satisfaction. She considered her position. She could sell the tome to Crepin for 8,500 gold, leaving her with a 900 gold loss. Her eyes drifted to the letter resting on her desk. In it, Ed asked her to purchase the tome at any cost, promising in return to grant her any favour she wished. A favour from Ed, for just 900 gold. It was an incredible bargain. She pressed the letter to her chest, cheeks warm as she sank onto her bed. For a moment she let herself savour the thought, then wondered what favour she should ask of him. At his camp, Ed sat near the fire with Ziggs. Ziggs reported that he had delivered the letter, and that Lortel's face had lit up when she read it. Ed felt a pang of guilt for asking such a large favour. Before he could dwell on it, a panicked voice called from nearby, relieved that he was finally awake. Yenneka rushed over, her eyes full of worry. Ed asked why she was here so early. Didn't she have classes? She explained they were already over, as Ed apologised for troubling her. Ziggs added that she had been in tears the whole time, and the students even thought she was heartbroken. Yenneka's face flushed as she pinched his cheek to silence him, then summoned a bear spirit to drag him away. Muggs appeared from behind her, eyes brimming with tears. He rushed forward and begged to be punished. He cried that he should have seen how overworked Ed was and eased his burdens. He admitted he had wanted to apologise sooner, but with Ed so weakened, he had feared his presence would only worsen things. Ed reassured him there was no need to worry. Ziggs returned with the battered bear spirit leaning on him, and reminded Ed that Muggs has been worrying for 10 days now, so he should go easy on him. Ed's eyes widened. 10 days had already passed. He realised he was far behind on his chores, and all his food supplies must have spoiled by now. Standing, he sighed, saying he needed to restock on food and firewood. Yenneka urged him to think about his health first and promised to help. Ziggs insisted he could hunt and gather firewood. If they worked together, everything could be managed step by step. Ed looked at his shack, remembering when he first came to the forest with nothing. Now, with Yenneka and Ziggs beside him, he felt a rare sense of gratitude. Somehow, everything would work out. Later at the Great Spirit Tree, Yenneka lay against Merilda's soft fur. The guardian spirit's voice was calm but firm. Ed was still vulnerable at camp, and the vixen was busy with negotiations. If Yenneka wanted to take him for herself, she needed to be just as cunning. Merilda pointed out that her apron already made her look like a housewife. Now she only needed to show Ed what a good wife she could be. Yenneka leapt to her feet, thanking Merilda eagerly before hurrying off. That night, at the cabin, Ed had just finished his supper. The taste lingered pleasantly, and he thought to himself that he should ask Yenneka to teach him how to cook. Still weakened, he lay back down to rest. The door creaked open. Yenneka stepped inside, her smile mischievous as she asked how he was feeling. Ed, startled, asked what she was doing there. Yenneka quietly told Ed he looked tired. He asked why she hadn't gone back to her dorm. Smiling, she sat on the floor beside his bed, leaning against it. She told him to stop pretending he was fine when his body was clearly worn down. If the body was exhausted, she said, the soul would sink with it. When she had struggled before, many people had offered consolations and help. But what had encouraged her most was Ed's quiet presence. He hadn't tried to comfort her with words. He had simply stayed by her side. Turning toward him, she softly repeated something he had once told her. It had been hard, but he had done really well. Ed tried to insist she didn't need to do this for him, but she silenced him with a stern look. He needed to admit he required rest. After a moment, he gave in and laid back down. Closing his eyes, he admitted that things had been difficult of late, and soon sleep overtook him. The next morning, Ed awoke to bird song and sunlight streaming through the window. Looking down, he saw Yenneka asleep on the floor, her head resting on the bed, a small trail of drool at the corner of her mouth. He couldn't help but smile. He felt better already. Later that morning, Ed washed up outside, the cold water clearing the last traces of fatigue from his mind. Still, he couldn't ignore how little progress he had made in the past 10 days. His magical engineering had stalled. Advancing further required formulas, yet those were usually rewards from main quests, precisely the kind of events he'd been avoiding. Taylor likely had a few formulas by now, though he didn't seem interested in magical engineering, probably because the materials were rare. For Ed, that wasn't a problem. He had someone right there who could find anything for the right price. He looked across the fire at Lortel. She smiled and told him she was glad to see him looking better. She admitted she was exhausted herself with everything happening in the Elt company. Ed remarked that she still found time to come out to his camp. She explained that she needed to get away sometimes, and this was the perfect place. Her tone shifted as she confessed that with her father removed, the name Elty no longer fit the company. She wondered aloud what she should rename it. Then she turned to Ed, saying she could use a partner in managing it. To her, he was the obvious choice. Ed called it a strange choice. He wondered if her feelings were clouding her judgment. She answered with quiet conviction. She needed someone who would never betray her, someone who would stand by her even with nothing to offer. Resting her hand lightly on his, she told him there was no one else she could think of. She asked for nothing more than for him to stay at her side, and suggested almost playfully that they should marry. Ed stared at her, momentarily caught off guard. After a pause, he told her she had almost convinced him. Lortel burst into laughter, admitting she nearly had him. He teased that her voice had cracked, giving her away. Their laughter faded, and she grew serious again. It hadn't all been a lie. Silence lingered between them until Ed said that for now, his only goal was to graduate. She smiled and told him she could wait. After graduation, she would see where he stood. Then, with a sly look, she reminded him he might not have a choice. She held up the letter he had written her, waving it between her fingers. He still owed her a favour. Rising, she walked away, saying it had been nice to talk with him again after so long. Yet as she left, she thought to herself that she had meant to press the favour harder, but seeing his face, she couldn't bring herself to. She even had the change from his purchase of magical engineering items, but forgot to give it to him. She decided to drop it off at his cabin. As she approached, the door suddenly burst open. Yenneka stepped out, having just woken up, and said aloud that Ed must have gone to the river and she should make him breakfast. Her words froze as her eyes met Lortel's. The two stared at one another in disbelief. Then, almost in unison, they demanded to know why the other was there. Neither moved, their gazes locked, tension hanging heavy between them. Later, Ed felt well enough to chop some wood, with Muggs keeping close at his side. The spirit fussed over him, making sure he ate properly and didn't overexert himself. Ed reassured him that he was fine, though Muggs's worried eyes lingered. While resting from the work, Ed looked over the 3 letters that had arrived before he collapsed from overwork. The first was from Lortel, warning him that her father might try something in retaliation. The second was from the princess, informing him of Crepin's recent movements. The third bore the seal of the Academy, and to his surprise, it was from Professor Glast. The letter requested a personal meeting after the conference. Because of his collapse, Ed had missed the chance to see him. He wondered what Glast wanted, as Professor Glast was the final boss of Act 2. Ed recalled how that act had unfolded. Silvenia, the most gifted mage in history, was a figure Glast revered. To him, only individuals of unparalleled talent could reshape the world. His obsession had driven him to attempt the impossible, using celestial magic to bend the laws of nature and resurrect the great sage Silvenia. After Lortel acquired the sealed tome, Glast had stolen it and chosen Ayla's body as the vessel for Silvenia's soul. It was the act of a fanatic, one who sought to usher in a new era of progress at any cost. But he had made a crucial mistake. By kidnapping Ayla, he had provoked Taylor, her childhood friend. In the end, it was Taylor who foiled his plan, and that failure led to Glast's downfall. That was how the final arc of the act began, with Ayla's abduction. But the question remained, how had Ed ended up being kidnapped as well? Ayla awoke in terror, recoiling at the sight of Ed and shouting for him to stay away. He sighed and told her he had been kidnapped as well. None of this had been part of his plan. 3 days earlier, after finally catching up on the tasks he had neglected while collapsed, Ed had been thinking ahead. The glass arc would soon begin, yet his magical engineering skills were still lagging behind. He needed blueprints and resources to raise his level to where it needed to be. Then it came to him, one clear shortcut. Of the 4 areas in the subjugation of Glast, the most dangerous was the secret laboratory. Its guardian, Raina, ruled the Soul Library. Without the Swordmaster skill, she was almost impossible to defeat, but Taylor could handle that part. What mattered to Ed were the treasures hidden in the library, countless rare magical engineering formulas, including 2 at the legendary level. Risky, yes, but with the right help. He glanced at Yenneka. It might be possible. Meanwhile, Professor Glast was addressing Class A. Only 3 students sat within, Ziggs, Lortel, and Lucy. He announced that 2 more would join next semester, Ayla and Adele. Lortel recalled their names, Both were talented. Class A was unusually full, as some years it had no students at all. Ziggs raised a hand and asked why only talent decided entry. Shouldn't students be trained to grow, not simply judged by what they already had? Glass calmly countered, saying it would be cruel to push those without talent toward impossible expectations. Lortel thought to herself that it all made sense. Glass' obsession with talent most likely came from his daughter. Muri had been an ordinary mage, but he had believed in her potential as any parent would. Pushing herself not to disappoint him, she had joined a raid before she was ready and had never come back. Ever since, Glass had poured himself into researching celestial magic, fixated not so much on the art itself, but on the sage who created it, the great sage Silvenia. Ed, finishing his own class, mapped out his next move. The event would soon start. Once Taylor discovered Ayla's kidnapping, he would rush in to rescue her, while Ed trailed behind, collecting what he could. He even had a list ready: Glock's eyes, Delheim's hourglass, and other valuable relics. Afterward, he would sit back and watch Taylor's climactic battle before slipping away to camp. It was foolproof, he thought. Yenneka had already agreed to meet him at the waterways, the entrance to the lab. But then Professor Cleo approached, saying Glass wanted to see him. Ed hesitated, then agreed. Glass had summoned him once before his collapse, so perhaps it was the same matter. Inside Glass's office, he found Ayla. She stiffened at once, demanding to know why he was there. Ed admitted her reaction was fair. He had fought her and Taylor during the Ophelis Hall incident, but then the weight of the situation hit him. Ayla was here now, yet this was the moment she was supposed to be kidnapped. He rushed to a desk piled with papers, searching for some clue. Among them, he found a report, on himself, written by Professor Cleo. They had clearly learned of his role in the Ophelis Hall incident, but what connection did that have here? Footsteps echoed. He turned and drew his dagger as Glass entered. Ayla ran to the professor, begging him for help against Ed. With a flick of his hand, Glass froze her in time prison. Then his attention fell on Ed. Before he could act, the dagger flew straight toward Glass and exploded. Once the smoke settled, Glass was still standing. He complimented Ed on his reactions, wondering if he had figured out the truth after looking at only a few documents. Ed ducked behind a desk, demanding to know why Glass was after him. He already had Ayla. Wasn't it her sensitivity to celestial magic that he needed? What could he possibly want with him? Glass' reply was vague. He had his reasons. Ed's mind raced. If he fled, Glass would only pursue him, throwing the story further off course. But if he allowed himself to be captured, the plot could realign. 2 captives instead of 1. He made his decision and stood from behind the desk, allowing time prison to bind him. Glass stepped closer, studying him. At first he hadn't thought much of Ed, but his grades had risen remarkably, even while living in the forest. He must be working hard, and in combat he had the instincts to survive. It reminded Glass of something he had lost. The memory of his daughter still haunted him, always trying to please him. At that moment, Mug slipped out from Ed and flew into the sky, heading toward Yenneka. An old man sat writing the final words of his memoir, the exploration record of magic. The man was Archmage Glocht. He reflected on his days with his master Silvenia, and the grief that had consumed him when she faded from this world. His gaze shifted to Lucy, sleeping beside him, and he thought that those left behind must grow stronger. He dedicated the last line of his book to her, the last purpose of his life. A short while later, Lucy stood at his bedside, the book in hand, tears streaming down her face as her beloved master passed away. In the present, Lucy lay on the roof of Ed's cabin, lost in the memory. She whispered that she missed him as she gazed at the sky, wondering if she would ever escape the grief. The only comfort she found was in the jerky that warmed her heart. But as she looked at the bag in her hand, she realised it was empty. She glanced around for Ed, but saw only Yenneka. At that moment, Mug fluttered in, whispering something to her. Lucy watched Yenneka's aura flare violently, her magic lashing out in fury at whatever she had just heard. Over at the Trix Hall meeting room, Lortel and the highest-ranking members of the Academy gathered in secret for the resonance ritual, the transfer of the sealed tome to her possession. Even the headmaster himself was present. As the ritual began, Lortel compared the headmaster to Crepin. The two were of similar years, yet the contrast in how they carried themselves was obvious. After the bidding, Crepin had approached her, asking to purchase the tome. She had told him the price was 12,000 gold. He accepted without hesitation, then smugly mentioned that her father Elter had dispatched a band of mercenaries marching toward the academy even now. That was why he pressed for the transaction immediately. The arrogance in his tone irritated her, but his information was valuable. All she needed was to gain ownership of the tome and turn a profit. It seemed simple, but just as the headmaster prepared to complete the transfer, the ritual was interrupted. Professor Glass appeared before the tome. Elemental spirits filled the room. The headmaster struggled to hold them off as Glass snatched the tome and vanished. Back in the secret laboratory, Ayla still couldn't understand why Ed was there. She pressed him for answers, but Ed only sighed, wondering whether Glass had stolen the tome yet. From the other side of the bars, a man approached, warning her to be silent. Behind him loomed a massive creature, clearly meant to guard the cell. The man was Coombe, a researcher of celestial magic. He explained that they should be grateful. Professor Glass had specifically forbidden him from using them in his experiments, as they were considered necessary. Ed wondered what that meant. Coombe said Ed was calmer than expected, then walked off, declaring he had more important research to attend to. Ed slumped against the wall, thinking all he could do was wait for rescue. Afterward, he could retrace Taylor's steps and find the formulas he needed. The only problem was being trapped in a cell with Ayla, who still crouched defensively in the corner. He told her there was no need to fear him. He wasn't going to harm her. He understood her cautious nature and, truthfully, held no ill will toward her. But Ayla glared back, insisting he was lying. To her, he was still Ed Rothstaler. He told her to stop being dramatic and wait. Taylor would come to rescue her. Then, after a pause, he admitted he was sorry for what had happened at the entrance exam. He had his reasons, but there was no excuse. At the very least, he reminded her, he had helped during the glass can incident. She might not place her trust in him, but she could believe in Taylor. Ayla froze, stammering in disbelief. Did he just apologise? Ed Rothstaler apologising? Suddenly, Mug burst into the cell, frantic and overprotective, rambling about whether Ed was all right. Ed thanked him for finding him and patted his head, relieved. Ayla asked if he could really summon spirits now. Ed dismissed her, saying it wasn't her business. At least now he could talk to someone better. She pressed, asking if he could use the spirit to send for help. Ed thought to himself that doing so would only ruin the storyline. Mug reassured him. It had taken almost half a day, but he had managed to alert Yenneka. She was furious, her aura terrifying. Even better, the vixen and the witch kid had agreed to help too. Everything would be fine, Mug insisted. Ed's relief curdled into anger. His pat turned into a tight squeeze around Mug's head. Ayla asked what was wrong, but Ed only whispered something into Mug's ear before hurling him through the bars. He called out to Coombe, demanding release. He couldn't just sit here any longer. Coombe warned him that making too much noise would awaken the monstrous guardian. Ed replied that if he wasn't freed, Coombe would face bigger trouble. Coombe laughed, saying he knew Ed's composure was nothing but an act. He was just an ordinary student after all. With that, Coombe turned his back on the cell and left. Ayla asked why he was suddenly agitated. Ed told her to be quiet as Mug returned, clutching a set of keys. He chirped proudly that they had been right where Ed said they'd be. Ed told Mug to leave the laboratory, knowing things were already complicated now that Yenneka and the others had been alerted. Unlocking the cell, he stepped out and quickly shut the door behind him, locking Ayla inside. She demanded to know what he was doing. Ed told her to listen carefully. It was too dangerous for her to leave, so when Coombe returned she should tell him Ed had escaped. That way, they wouldn't torture her for information. She tried to argue, but he pressed her to answer. After a moment, she agreed. Then she asked about him. Wasn't it dangerous for him to be out there alone? He told her not to worry and sprinted down the hall. As he ran, he thought that he could manage with Yenneka and Lortel being here, but Lucy was another matter. Her presence would lead to the worst possible ending. Lucy would become an enemy, and there was no way he could ever defeat her. No matter what, he had to stop her from coming. At Ophelis Hall, Ziggs was in the middle of his usual workout when Taylor suddenly burst into his room. Out of breath, Taylor asked for his help. He needed Ziggs to come with him to rescue Ayla. Ed, meanwhile, already knew how things were supposed to unfold. Taylor would seek Ziggs's aid, then make his way through the underground waterways, passing 4 distinct areas before finally reaching the laboratory. Ed was familiar with the path, though he had never attempted it in reverse. Right now, he was in the Monster Research Lab, one of the most dangerous areas. Normally this place teemed with threats, but since he was moving backward through the route, none of the creatures had been awakened yet. He managed to slip through without incident. He needed to move quickly, but there was a problem. The guardian of the Soul Library, Raina, stood between him and the exit. Crouching low, Ed moved along the edges of the library, slipping behind desks as he tracked Raina's patrol routes. He knew them well, and he also knew how to defeat her if it came to a fight. Still, he wanted to avoid conflict. Raina was an important obstacle meant for Taylor's growth. Among the mini-bosses of this stage, both Raina and the Devil revived in the waterways would give Taylor crucial experience. For that reason, Ed wanted to bypass her while collecting the magical items he needed along the way. Glancing over his list, he frowned at how many valuable artifacts he would have to leave behind for now. He decided he could come back later, once Taylor defeated Raina. Muggs whispered that Raina had moved away, and the path to the exit was clear. Ed rose and hurried forward, but before he could escape, the ground shuddered with a violent tremor. A distant explosion boomed through the halls. He froze. An earthquake? That wasn't something he remembered from the game. The bookshelf beside him toppled over with a crash, leaving him exposed. Raina turned toward him, her ghostly form gliding forward. The pale woman let out a piercing scream as her gaze locked on Ed. 30 minutes earlier, the battle in Trix Hall raged on after the sealed tome had been stolen. Lortel pulled a staff member out of danger, saving them from a rampaging spirit conjured by Professor Glass. She muttered that even with all the secrecy around the transaction, she could hardly believe the tome had truly been taken. The headmaster reassured her that he would take full responsibility. He promised he would reclaim the tome himself, then asked her to stay and help suppress Glass' rebellion. After a pause, he asked if she was familiar with the 3 forbidden acts. They were the laws of nature no one dared to twist. The pursuit of immortality. Reviving the dead. Turning back time. The meaning dawned on Lortel at once. She asked if Glass truly intended to bring someone back from the dead using celestial magic. Then, narrowing her eyes, she asked how long the headmaster had known about this. Instead of answering, he posed his own question. Who did she think Glass wished to revive? The person he revered above all else, the great sage Silvenia, or his own daughter, whose death weighed on him with unbearable guilt? Before Lortel could reply, a staff member rushed in with urgent news. Glass had been sighted heading into the underground waterways, and Taylor had already gone after him. Worse, according to a witness, Glass had taken 2 students hostage, Ayla Triss, a first year, and Ed Rothstaler, a second year. The moment Lortel heard Ed's name, her eyes widened. Then from outside, a low rumble and a bestial roar echoed. She darted to a window, snatching binoculars from someone standing nearby. Through the glass she saw a blazing dragon of fire, Takan, towering over the trees as it advanced toward the waterway entrance. A lone figure stood on its head. Lortel focused the lens until she saw Yenneka, her expression frantic. Declaring that she would rescue Ed as well, Lortel swore she would retrieve the sealed tome herself. The first mini-boss blocking the way was Dorothy, the Academy's top third-year alchemy student. Her skills in combat were remarkable for an alchemist, enough to challenge even those in the combat department. As a first year, Dorothy had blended into the crowd without standing out. But Professor Glass had seen her potential and extended his hand to her. To her, he was a saviour, and she was willing to oppose the school itself for his sake. Now, however, she knelt trembling, unable to face what loomed before her. Staring at the fire dragon and Yenneka standing before her, she stammered that this was too much. Yenneka's expression was cold as she demanded to know where Ed was. Her glare bore into Dorothy, who promptly fainted, collapsing on the ground. Yenneka dismounted from Tarkan, her spirits gathering protectively around her. She asked the dragon to recall the directions it had received from Muggs. With so many twists and turns, she grew flustered trying to remember. Looking down at Dorothy's unconscious form, she realised she had been the one to frighten her into this state. She reached out and quietly covered Dorothy's face. A voice called her name. Yenneka turned to see Lortel approaching with her servants. Lortel's heart skipped a beat at the sight of Dorothy on the ground, and Yenneka kneeling over her, covering her face. For a brief, chilling moment, Lortel imagined Yenneka had killed her outright. She swallowed hard, remembering that Yenneka was counted among Silvenia's strongest combatants, second only to Lucy. If it meant keeping Ed safe, Yenneka would tear the entire academy apart. The thought struck her with sudden dread. If Yenneka rescued Ed, Ed might fall for her. Worse, she imagined them getting married. The very idea made her blurt out a panicked no. Normally cold and calculating, Lortel lost her composure when it came to him. Forcing herself to think, she lied smoothly. She claimed Ed had already been rescued, that he was injured and bedridden, and that he was asking for Yenneka. Yenneka's sharp eyes narrowed. She demanded to know why Lortel would lie about that. She explained that she had come as soon as she found out where Ed was, so how could it be possible that he had already been rescued? For all her absent-minded nature, when it came to Ed, Yenneka's mind worked twice as fast. Caught, Lortel gave a nervous laugh and said she must have been mistaken. Yenneka cut her off, insisting there was no time to waste. They had to find Ed now. Lortel thought quickly. Yenneka hadn't said anything wrong, and there was no reason to oppose her directly. On Yenneka's side, she remembered asking Lucy for help earlier, only for Lucy to yawn and wander off for a walk. She might actually need Lortel's cooperation now. The two girls exchanged a tense stare before agreeing this wasn't the time to get in each other's way. Lortel told her staff to remain behind. It was too dangerous for them. Together, she and Yenneka decided to split their efforts, one searching the eastern side and the other the west. Then they sprinted off in opposite directions, each determined to be the one who found Ed first. Back in the library, Ed faced Raina just after the earthquake struck. The shelves trembled, dust rained from the ceiling, and the ghostly guardian's scream echoed as she glided toward him. He glanced upward as cracks split across the stone overhead. Then, with a thunderous crash, the ceiling gave way. Rubble collapsed directly onto Raina, burying her beneath broken stone and wood. Ed shielded his face from the dust, coughing as he tried to make out what had happened. Through the settling haze, he spotted a small figure perched casually atop the wreckage. Lucy sat on the rubble, rubbing her sleepy eyes. She looked at Ed with her usual drowsy indifference, then yawned. In a sluggish voice, she said she had been bored, so she came to rescue him. On the roof of the academy, the principal stood overlooking the school grounds. Another man stood beside him, watching in silence. The man asked if it was really acceptable to let the incident continue unchecked. The principal replied that while it was dangerous, it was also a rare opportunity for the students to grow stronger. The man pressed him, saying the academy was already experiencing a golden age. Every year might see one exceptional student, but now they had several rising stars all at once. Was this level of danger truly necessary? The principal's gaze stayed fixed on the view before him. He admitted that might be so, but he had a feeling of what was to come. For that, the students would need to become even stronger. Back in the underground waterways, Lucy's wide eyes fixed on Ed as she asked if he had any jerky. Ed put a hand to his head, exasperated. Did she really think he would? Disappointed, Lucy floated away, saying she would just find somewhere to nap. Ed stopped her immediately. He thought to himself that Yenneka and Lortel must have already entered the waterways by now, searching for him. He needed to stop them before they reached Glast. Taylor should manage, especially with one less mini-boss to deal with, now that Raina was no longer a threat. The real problem was Lucy. If she ran into Glast directly, events would tilt toward the bad ending. He had to keep her close. He told her to stay with him. She asked why. He answered that she was strong and he would feel safer with her by his side. Her eyes narrowed again. Was he absolutely sure he didn't have any jerky? He told her no, and asked her to forget about it. What he needed was for her to do him a favour, stay with him until he made it out of the underground waterways. Lucy replied that she could just use magic to take him out now. But Ed shook his head. He had something he needed to do first. She thought it over for a moment, then agreed, but only in exchange for a favour of her own. A little later, Ed sprinted down the halls with Lucy fast asleep on his back. Of all things, the favour she had asked for was to be carried while she napped. As he ran, he decided he would only take the bare minimum of magical items he needed. His real focus was on finding Yenneka and Lortel before they complicated things further. Meanwhile, Lortel moved quickly through the waterways in search of Ed. She sensed faint traces of concealing magic nearby. Her talent in magic resonance, something even Professor Glast had acknowledged, allowed her to navigate the labyrinth with ease. Unlike Yenneka, who excelled in spirit magic, Lortel's specialty let her move faster and more decisively. Something stirred within her as she pressed forward. For once, she wasn't being driven by profit. Instead, she was moving for someone else. The realization made her heart pound, just as it had that night in Ophelis Hall. Suddenly, the wall beside her exploded outward. Shielding her face from the debris, she looked up to see Ed stepping through the dust, his coat weighed down with magical items and Lucy fast asleep on his back. He greeted her calmly, saying he was glad she was there, that he had been kidnapped. Then he asked her to help carry some of the items he was holding. Lortel froze, struck speechless at the sight of him. Without a word, she took the items automatically, only realizing moments later how flustered she had become. Shaking her head, she snapped herself back to her senses and demanded to know, wasn't he in danger? Ed admitted he had been, but glanced back at Lucy resting on his shoulders and said it had all worked out. Lortel's eyes narrowed. How could he carry another girl so casually, as though it meant nothing? Before she could dwell on it, Ed was already asking her to sort through some scrolls. If she had any of the ingredients he needed, he said he would gladly purchase them. Her frustration boiled over. She shouted his name in anger. Ed leaned closer, making her freeze at the sudden closeness. He told her she was the only one he could trust with this. Her heart thudded harder in her chest. She wanted to resist, not to let herself be taken advantage of, but the moment he added that he was grateful for her help, her resolve melted away. She gave in with a bright smile, agreeing without hesitation. Then a voice called out to her. Lortel looked down the hall to see one of her assistants out of breath. He ran up and told her something terrible had happened. At the same time, Taylor pushed forward with his group, Clevius, Elvira, Ziggs, and Adele, making their way toward Ayla. Adele, gifted with foresight, warned them that she sensed something ahead. Their opponent would be formidable. She pointed toward the left passage of 2 possible routes. Before anyone could move, the wall of that passage exploded outward. Takan burst through, flames blazing, carrying Cleo dangling helplessly from its mouth by the back of her shirt. Flailing in panic, she cried out apologies, insisting she had only acted on a whim and begged to be spared. Takan dropped her unceremoniously to the ground, where she fainted on the spot. Yenneka stepped forward with a calm sigh, remarking that perhaps they had taken another wrong turn. Then she looked at Taylor's group and smiled, greeting them warmly. Taylor and Elvira immediately fell into defensive stances, tension rippling through them. Ziggs, however, simply waved back, unconcerned. But Taylor and Elvira remembered well the sense of dread from the Ophelis Hall incident. Facing Yenneka again now was enough to make their nerves fray. As they braced for combat, Yenneka tilted her head in confusion, wondering why they seemed angry with her. Ziggs tried to hold Taylor back, telling him to calm down, but Taylor refused to relax his guard. Just then, a voice echoed from the other passage. Ed emerged with Lortel at his side, telling them to stop. Yenneka's eyes lit up. She rushed to him, cupping his cheeks with both hands and asking if he was all right. Elvira's jaw tightened. She leaned closer to Taylor, whispering that now their situation had worsened. If Ed was here, allied with both Yenneka and Lortel, there was no chance they could overcome him. They had barely defeated him at Ophelis Hall. Ed stepped toward Taylor. Placing a firm hand on his shoulder, he told him that Ayla was waiting for him and that he should go stop Glast. Taylor stood silent, staring at him in surprise. Without another word, Ed ran past Lucy, still asleep on his back, and headed for the exit. He thought to himself that it was time for everyone to play their part. Taylor's group would handle Glast. As for him, he needed to deal with the unexpected variable. It was time to take down Elte. One of Lortel's employees had reported news they had all known was inevitable. The mercenaries hired by Elte had reached Akan Island. In the original story, Elte had been thoroughly defeated and never had the chance to stage a comeback. But this time, he had been ousted earlier than planned. He had fled, regrouped, and prepared his revenge. Ed knew Elte was supposed to be the mid-boss of Act 2. If he could eliminate him now, the story would still follow its proper course. He had to take him down here. As he passed Taylor's group, Ed called out to Ziggs. If Ziggs followed the path Ed had come from, it would be mostly clear and lead them straight to Ayla. She would fill them in once she was safe. Then he turned to Taylor, pausing briefly before wishing him luck. With that, Ed, Lortel and Yenneka set off, joined by one of Lortel's staff. As they ran, Lortel filled Ed in on the situation with Elte. Ed said they should try to warn the staff members as soon as possible. Yenneka stopped him, telling him to wait. When he dismissed her, insisting they had to hurry, she raised her voice in anger. He was still not fully recovered from collapsing. How could he think of fighting Elte now? Tears welled in her eyes as she begged him not to get involved. This was Lortel's company's business, not his. She didn't want to see him hurt anymore. Ed hesitated. She was right. He had no reason to involve himself. But for the sake of the story, Elte had to be removed, but he couldn't tell her that. Before he could reply, Lortel surprised him by siding with Yenneka. She admitted that involving Ed would be selfish of her, and told him to go home and recover. The two nodded at each other in agreement, leaving Ed stunned. They were actually getting along, but he couldn't just leave. Ed thanked Yenneka for worrying about him, but insisted he didn't agree that this had nothing to do with him. Yenneka blinked at him, flustered, and asked what he meant by that. Lortel, on the other hand, blushed at the thought that Ed was taking her side. Ed brushed past it, telling them there was no time to explain. They had to keep moving. Yenneka frowned, suspicious. Nervously, she asked if he had some kind of contract with Lortel. Was that why he was helping her? Ed nodded, saying he needed the magical engineering items. Lortel only smiled, her cheeks warming further. They reached Dorothy, still unconscious where she had fallen. Ed commented that Taylor had gone a little too far against his upperclassmen. Yenneka knelt beside Dorothy, checking her condition. Guilt overcame her, and she burst into tears, insisting she hadn't meant to hurt her so badly. Through sobs, she asked Ed not to think poorly of her. The group pressed on until they reached the exit. Lortel assured Ed that the carriage she had arrived in should be waiting just outside. But when they stepped out into the open air, the carriage lay wrecked and her staff was sprawled unconscious on the ground. Elta stood waiting. Lortel gulped, admitting he had arrived faster than she expected. Elta sneered, saying that just as he had taught her, she had tried to erase every trace of her plot to remove him from the company. But her employees were weak. With the slightest threat, they had betrayed her and brought her here. The staff member who had accompanied them stepped to Elta's side, bowing in apology. Lortel smiled, trying to hide her hurt, but Elta knew that practiced expression all too well. He told her it was a shame. The only proof he could obtain now would have to be tortured out of her. Snapping his fingers, he signalled the unconscious staff. They leapt to their feet, drawing blades and surrounding the group. One lunged at Ed, but Lortel intercepted with her magic. She asked how he dared bring mercenaries onto school grounds. Elta only laughed, boasting that he had brought the strongest mercenaries on the continent. More emerged from behind the trees, archers knocking arrows while others advanced with swords. He ordered them to keep Lortel alive, but kill the rest. Arrows rained down. Yenneka swept her hand through the air, wind magic bursting outward to deflect them all. Ed thanked her. Elta frowned. Elementalists were such a nuisance. Reaching into his coat, he pulled out a scroll. Ed's eyes widened. He recognised it instantly. Valara's Prejudice, a spell that restricted all mana within its range for 10 minutes. It was a superior version of Elvira's Night Butterfly reagent and probably cost a fortune to acquire. The only drawback was its slow activation time, but with all these mercenaries protecting him, that wouldn't matter. And if it went off, they were finished. Every one of them relied on magic. Lortel voiced the same thought. They couldn't let Elta finish that scroll, or it was over. Ed shouted at Elta, asking how he thought he could get away with this. Could he handle the consequences? Elta laughed bitterly, saying it was still better than losing his life. Ed understood. At his core, Elta was only trying to survive, just like him. But he couldn't let him win, not for his own selfish reasons. Ed lowered Lucy gently to the ground and told her it was time to wake up. Lucy yawned, rubbing her eyes, asking why it was so noisy. Then, whoosh! Her magic erupted outward in a single pulse, raw and overwhelming. The mercenaries flinched instinctively, staggering back under its weight. Lazy Lucy has awakened. The final book, written by Glocked, The Exploration Record of Magic, was completed in a small hut. He had shut himself away to focus on what he knew would be his last work, with only Lucy by his side. She floated lazily next to him, listening as he shared words of wisdom while his pen moved across the pages. He told her that no matter how powerful she became, she must never stop learning. She needed to remain humble and use her gifts to help others. He warned her that with great power would come loneliness, but before he said more, he stopped himself and asked her to make a promise. She was never to kill anyone, not even indirectly, and she must go to Silvenia Academy and carry out her duties as a student. In the present, Lucy faced the mercenaries as she unleashed her power. Even as veteran fighters who had seen death countless times, they trembled before her. They recognised the kind of danger that meant certain death, and none dared to move. Lucy stepped toward Elta, her movements carrying raw magical pressure. The men stood frozen in fear, but Elta shouted at them, demanding to know what was wrong. One inexperienced mercenary, unable to sense the overwhelming danger like the others, gritted his teeth and lunged at her with his sword. Lucy flicked her finger, and the sheer physical force of her condensed magic sent him flying, crashing into the distance as the rest of the mercenaries looked on in horror. She walked up to Elta and remarked that he must be the leader. Then, raising her hand as if to flick him aside the same way, she said she supposed she would have to deal with him too. Elta dropped to the ground in fear, but before she could act, Ed walked up behind Lucy and placed a hand on her shoulder, telling her that was enough. A distant rumble followed. Purple lightning split the skies above the academy grounds. Ed glanced upward and noticed the 7 large stars had aligned. This was the moment Glass's plan became possible. Magical towers erupted from the ground surrounding the school. Ed recognised it immediately. This was the scene where the final battle of Act 2 would begin. Everything seemed to be unfolding on schedule, he thought. By now, Taylor should have already defeated the boss in the underground waterways and would soon be facing Glust. Lucy floated past Ed and stared at the rising towers. She recognised them as the 10 Towers of Magic. Longing filled her eyes as she whispered that it might now be possible to resurrect the dead. Normally, Lucy was meant to be asleep during these events, but when she was part of the party, the story changed. Once Glust was cornered, he offered her a proposition. Instead of resurrecting Silvenia, he promised to bring back her student, the Archmage Glocked. Lucy accepts and the party is wiped out. No one ever found a way to defeat her. As Ed remembered this, Elter seized his chance. He grabbed the scroll and activated it, shouting to his men that no one could use magic now. They needed to attack. One mercenary rushed at Ed, sword raised, but Ed cast Windblade and sent him tumbling back. Elter's eyes went wide. He demanded to know how Ed had used a spell. Looking up at Lucy, he realised the truth as Ed explained that even a legendary spell like that had its limits. It was draining Lucy's magic, but she had so much that it was like trying to empty an ocean. The seal simply couldn't keep up. The spell shattered. Lucy hovered above them, staring down at Elter. She told him to get out of her way. She had somewhere to be. Elter collapsed to his knees. Every instinct screamed that his life was about to end. Lucy raised her hand, ready to flick him aside. But Ed stepped between them, warning her that if she did, she might kill him. Lucy froze, her master's words echoing in her mind, never kill. She hesitated as Ed met her eyes, his expression heavy with concern. Then she floated away. Ed asked where she was going. Lucy answered that his favour was over, and she had somewhere else to be. Knowing what she intended, he asked if she was certain she would not regret it. She paused in mid-air, thinking back to Glock's final moments. After a long silence, she answered no, then she flew off toward the towers. A little later, Yenneka had helped evacuate the staff from the island, while Lortel captured Elter and tied him up inside. Making his way upstairs, Ed thought that between the two of them, they should be able to handle the rest. His path led him back to Trix Hall, the very place where everything had begun. He hadn't expected to return here, but there was someone he needed to see. The Glocked Foundation had been the reason he was able to pay his tuition. Glocked had left all his wealth to Silvenia to support students in need, and even now, traces of him could be found throughout the academy. Ed climbed to the roof and found Lucy there, sitting in silence. It hadn't been hard to guess. This was the place where the entire academy could be seen at a glance. To Lucy, the academy itself was a memento of Glocked. Ed approached Lucy, who sat staring into the distance at the towers. She asked him if he had any jerky. He told her no. He asked what she was doing sitting there. Lucy said she was feeling nostalgic, then tapped the ledge beside her, gesturing for him to sit. She explained that something very sad had happened to her long ago. She had cried and cried, but eventually the tears stopped. Ed sat down next to her and asked why. She answered that there was no real reason, only that time had passed. Current events had reopened old wounds. She had thought about bringing her master back, but in the end, she realised that even if she did, she would only have to say goodbye again. He had been ready to pass on, and he had made all the preparations he needed. Bringing him back would probably make him angry. Lucy admitted she knew it was selfish, but she didn't care. Ed asked if she was all right. She spoke his name softly. Ed sighed, expecting her to ask for more jerky. But instead, she leaned her head on his shoulder, asking to borrow it. At that moment, he realised why she had gestured for him to sit beside her. She simply needed a shoulder to cry on. They sat together in silence, watching the towers. Despite the situation, the night sky looked beautiful. Meanwhile, Taylor's group was already locked in battle with Glust. A giant mechanical golem stood between them and Ayla, who was trapped within its heart. Glust himself fought the group, wielding magic with relentless force. Zig summoned a powerful wind spell, and massive hands formed from the currents, gripping the golem's arm and holding it back. He shouted for Taylor to reach Ayla. Taylor sprinted forward, leaping onto the restrained arm and racing toward the chest. Glass tried to intercept, but Taylor slashed through him. As his body was struck, Glass' thoughts drifted back. He remembered the countless hours spent in his office, watching the world change beyond his window. The first-year student, Dorothy, who had always come to him, eager to study advanced magic. The young assistant professor, constantly getting into trouble and offering apologies. The senior colleague who often joined him for tea, still visiting even after becoming headmaster. Through it all, he had buried himself in research, using it to smother the grief of losing his daughter. With a surge of power, Glass hurled Taylor back, then called upon celestial magic to rewind his wound, undoing the cut. His mind lingered on the past. No matter what he accomplished, those painful memories of loss never faded. Determined, he began casting a massive time prison, and the chamber warped with its power. At the last moment, Zig shoved Taylor clear, sacrificing himself. A heartbeat later, Ziggs, Elvira, and Adele were caught in the field, their bodies freezing in place. Taylor charged forward. Glast warned him not to stand in his way, as the golem began charging a devastating beam at him. Before it could fire, Taylor unleashed his swordmaster skill, slicing the golem into pieces. Glast rewound time again, repairing the machine with celestial magic. He told Taylor it was pointless, that he could never win. But before he could finish, an ice spear struck him from the side. Reversing time had also undone the prison, releasing Ziggs and the others. Zig shouted for Taylor to move. With a powerful strike, Taylor destroyed the golem again and reached Ayla. Glass staggered, realising it was over. Accepting his defeat, he stepped off the tower's edge, plummeting to the ground below. As he fell, a sorrowful look crossed his face, and he whispered that he missed her, his daughter, Muri. Before the ground could claim him, a magic circle opened beneath his body, his fall twisted into light, and he vanished. Far away in the woods, Glast reappeared, gravely wounded and leaning against a tree. He turned his head and saw Ed standing nearby. Weakly, he asked how Ed had known he would be there. 1 hour earlier, Lortel was making her way to meet Yenneka and Ed after handling the aftermath. She spotted Ed up ahead with Lucy at his side. Lucy clung lightly to his sleeve, and for the first time Lortel sensed she might have another rival. From the waterways, Cleo emerged, supporting Dorothy, who leaned heavily against her shoulder. Both looked shaken and upset. They flinched in fear as Yenneka arrived, leaping down from Tarkan's back. She asked Ed if the towers were made of celestial magic. When he confirmed, she explained that Tarkan had sensed that same kind of magic in the northern forest days earlier. There was only one man who could be responsible. Ed frowned. No magical towers had risen from the forest, so what had Glass been planning there? Just as Elta had returned, it was possible Glass might do the same if left unchecked. Ed decided he needed to investigate. Now, back in the present, Ed stood before Glass, who sat gravely wounded against a tree. Yenneka gasped at the sight of his injuries and asked what he was doing out here. Glass told her he had been looking at the moon, then asked if that sounded ridiculous. She told him it didn't. Ed asked if he had known his plan would fail. Glass chuckled quietly, admitting he had, though he hadn't expected to be stopped by students. Even if they had failed, Principal Obel would have stopped him. Perhaps Obel had even let things go this far because of their friendship. Looking back at Ed, Glass said he was a much better student than he had expected, and he regretted realising that so late. Ed asked why he had kidnapped him. Glass explained that at first it was because of his talent. He had hoped to recruit him into his plan. But when his body collapsed from overwork, that idea had ended. In the end, dying alone seemed a fitting price for all his sins. At least he had never been lonely during the 17 years he had spent with his daughter. Ed asked if she had been 17. Glass nodded. Some might say that was a long time, but to him it had been far too short. Ed crouched down to meet his eyes. He reminded Glass that he hadn't been alone. Professor Cleo had been by his side for years. She had studied under him for 4, then worked as his assistant for 5. They had passed her earlier, and she had been in tears. Even though she often said he was difficult, she also admitted he was the most scholarly man she had ever met. Dorothy, too, had been grieving. She hadn't understood his plan, but she had remained loyal. He had recognised her talent, and for that she would always be grateful. Ed told Glass he wasn't truly alone. He had unearthed and nurtured many hidden talents over the years. Just as he had believed in his daughter, he had shown faith in countless students, and they had all valued him. For a moment, Glass's weary eyes softened. He realised Ed was right. Despite everything, he hadn't been alone after all. Glass's breath grew weaker. He told Ed that before beginning the ritual, he had seen the state of the Soul Library. He had noticed that Ed had cleaned it out, taking the most valuable formulas. But he pointed out that Ed hadn't taken everything. When Ed asked what he had missed, Glass handed him a small key. The library now belonged to him. Ed asked why he was giving it to him. Glass brushed the question aside, telling him only that beneath the table Raina had been guarding was a hidden safe, and this key would open it. Turning to Lucy, Glass began to speak, urging her to look around her more often. But when he saw the expression on her face, he stopped and remarked that it was a wise decision. No one but Glass knew what her expression had been. A small, peaceful smile crossed his lips as he passed away. The others remained with him for a while, watching in silence. Later, Ed stood in the dean's office as the man reviewed his paperwork. The dean remarked that this was the second major incident Ed had been caught up in. Reading through Ed's written report, he wondered aloud why Ed had been kidnapped, then recited the events. Ed had escaped, encountered Taylor, and been joined by Yenneka and Lortel. Ed confirmed the account was correct. When the dean asked why he had left Ayla behind, Ed explained that she had been afraid of him. She hadn't trusted him, and that was why he had escaped alone. The dean nodded, saying he had heard enough. He admitted he had suspicions about Ed. His composure in these situations was far from ordinary. Leaning forward, he told Ed he wasn't as clueless as he pretended to be. Ed answered lightly, saying the dean was giving him too much credit. The dean slammed the report onto the desk, saying that no matter what, Ed was a victim of the Academy's negligence. Looking down, Ed realised he wasn't reading the incident report at all. It was his report card. The dean told him he had been working very hard, and the Academy intended to reward those efforts. A moment later, Ed stepped out of the office. Yenneka greeted him as Ed apologised for always worrying her. Then he asked if she was all right after such a tough fight trying to find him. She smiled and claimed she was fine, but when the bird spirit whispered in her ear, her expression faltered. Admitting she was sore, she rubbed at her back and said she had strained it while saving him. Ed frowned at her words, concern clear in his face as she continued her little act. He told her that she had always been there when he needed her, and he had taken that for granted. After Glass's final moments, he realised it was too late to have regrets once something was lost, and guilt pressed on him for being such a burden. Yenneka began to panic, realising where his words were leading. Ed bowed and said it might be better if she stayed away from him. Flustered, she quickly bowed as well. Blurting out that she was sorry and admitting she had lied, she wasn't hurt at all. She begged him to forgive her. Ed then asked if she was still staying in Dex Hall. Starting next semester, he might be there too. Her face lit up instantly, and she beamed with joy, asking excitedly if he truly meant it. Later, Ed made his way back to the cabin, thinking about the dean's words. The dean had told him to end his struggles in the forest, move into Dex Hall, and live as a regular student again. He had earned it. Standing outside the cabin, Ed paused to take in the sight. He looked around the camp, remembering all the work he had put into surviving here. He had planned to improve the camp over the break, but stepping through the door, he murmured that perhaps this marked the end of his life in the woods. Before he could settle into the thought, the roof shook and Lucy came crashing down onto the floor behind him, a startled look of surprise on her face. Lucy wandered through the forest, frowning at the distant mountains. This didn't look like Arcana Island. Then it struck her. She was dreaming of her childhood, She wondered why, but since she was here, she decided she might as well visit the old man. She opened the door and saw him sitting peacefully in golden sunlight streaming through the window. But the warmth bled away as the room twisted, darkening into a nightmare of tattered curtains and cobwebs. Her master turned his head to reveal a skeletal face, demanding to know why she hadn't resurrected him. Lucy sighed, realising it was only a nightmare. She awoke in bed, more annoyed than frightened. A maid greeted her and asked if she would like to get ready for school. Lucy paused, then shot straight out the window at full speed, deciding she felt like visiting the northern forest instead. She dropped onto the roof of Ed's cabin just as he was heading for the door. Seeing him brought an easy smile to her face. Something about him made her feel at ease. But when she heard him murmur that this could be the end of his life in the woods, the shock sent her tumbling from the roof. Ed glanced back, saw her sprawled on the ground, and thought cats were difficult to read. They never did what you wanted. When you showed them interest, they seemed indifferent, but the moment you ignored them, they wanted attention. Best to ignore them altogether, he decided, as he went inside, leaving Lucy lying there in shock. He thought back to his monster studies class. Professor Flubin had once explained the same thing, charming the class, especially the female students. After class, the professor asked Ed to see him in his lab and casually inquired if Ed knew about the scholarship system. Ed said yes. It reduced tuition in exchange for working for the academy. Holding a snake with one hand, Flubin told him it could be a great opportunity. Likely Ed would work under Professor Cleo, who was overwhelmed now that Glass was gone. A niece was helping her, but there was still far too much to do before the new students arrived. Ed rubbed his chin. That student should be arriving soon. Elsewhere, Lortel sat in her office, staring at the sealed tome she had just retrieved. She thought about Ed's request, that she purchase it for a favour. He had told her she could do whatever she wanted with it afterward, but she knew he hadn't wanted it to end up in Crepin's hands. Maybe she shouldn't sell it. She scolded herself for worrying about his feelings instead of profit. She needed to be ruthless. But as she looked again at his note, her eyes lingered on the words. Any favour. The sight made her cheeks warm. She tried to shake it off, burying herself in work, wondering who would take the special class during winter break now that Glass was gone. Everyone should be busy, so she told herself she wouldn't have to worry about rivals for now. Yet as she scribbled, she thought of Lucy. The thought made her snap her pen, leaving her unsettled by an ominous feeling. Back at the camp, Lucy lounged outside the cabin with jerky in her mouth, still in her pyjamas. She asked Ed if he had enough firewood and why he hadn't been hunting lately. Ed wondered why she was suddenly asking so many questions. He realised he had been neglecting his chores and thought maybe it was because he was preparing to move to Dex Hall. He suspected he wouldn't see Lucy as much once he left, but maybe that was better for keeping the story stable. Yenneka arrived, running and waving. Ed asked if she was done with classes already, and she said yes, she'd come to relax. Sitting down beside him, she explained that since he might be moving to Dex Hall soon, she wanted to spend as much time at the camp as possible. When Yenneka mentioned helping Ed settle into Dex Hall, Lucy glared. Ed wondered what he needed to finish before moving, then looked at the key Glass had given him. He'd need to open the hidden safe soon. Yenneka handed him a letter of invitation to Dex Hall, suggesting he fill it out in advance. When Ed thanked her, she offered to help. But before he could reply, Lucy appeared between them in a flash, arms outstretched to block Yenneka from Ed. She told him to stop. He must not accept the invitation. Days passed. Yenneka taught him spirit elementalism as usual, but often noticed Lucy watching from the trees. Yenneka wondered what she had done to upset her. Later, Ed sat in the cabin with a book, Lucy curled up on his lap as he tried to study. He was beginning to think it was time to learn intermediate magic. But the more he tried, the harder it became, and progress slowed. Wherever he went, Lucy clung to him, her hostility flaring whenever Yenneka appeared. Strangely, she seemed more afraid than angry. As Ed lay in bed struggling with his studies, Lucy asked what his plans were. Ed told her there was a place he wanted to visit. He added that he should gather firewood, since nights were getting colder and he might freeze if he wasn't careful. Of course, he wouldn't have to worry about that if he moved to Dex Hall. Still, he said he should focus on his chores before going anywhere. Lucy looked at him and told him they should go now, together. A little later, Ed lowered himself into the remains of the Soul Library, using a rope tied to a tree to reach the hole Lucy had made. She floated down beside him as he asked why she was so keen on coming with him. Lucy only replied that she could have carried him with her magic, but Ed explained that he needed to make the trip on his own. He planned to return more than once to collect all the magical items hidden inside. He pushed aside the broken table to reveal the safe beneath it. Using the key Glass had given him, he unlocked it. A brilliant light flared from within, flooding the ruined library with radiant energy. When it finally faded, Ed could hardly believe what he saw. Later, Ed tried climbing back out using the rope. The effort left him struggling, and he thought about his plans to meet Lortel soon for more magical engineering supplies. Maybe, while he was at it, he should purchase a ladder from her too. He decided to take a break and stopped to catch his breath. Lucy asked what the item in the safe had been. Ed told her it was the Golden Phoenix ring. It twisted the passage of time, letting the user borrow their future self's magic power in the present. In theory, he could cast advanced magic immediately, but there was a price. Use too much, and he'd be left unable to use magic for some time. It was meant only for extreme situations, a last resort. Still, he wondered aloud what he might achieve with it outside of combat, perhaps even forging a contract with a high-ranking spirit. Lucy asked why Glass would make such a thing. Ed said the reason no longer mattered. The truth was that the item contradicted everything Glass had stood for. All his years of research had been devoted to this ring. It was clear now he had intended it as a gift for his daughter. When Ed finally reached the surface, Lucy spoke up. She told him she once lost a button from her cuff. She hadn't noticed it much while it was there, but once it was gone, her sleeves constantly got in the way. That was when she realised how important it had been. For her, it was often like that, only noticing how important something was after it was gone. As Ed climbed out, breathing hard, he rested against a tree. Lucy admitted she'd come with him for another reason. She wanted to know if he was really going to move to Dex Hall, and asked with sadness in her voice, what if he didn't? Ed paused at her words. He hadn't made up his mind yet. Moving to Dex Hall would make his life easier, especially with winter on the way. Lucy agreed softly, then remarked that rain would be coming soon. Ed thought to himself that Lucy was often good at predicting the weather from the humidity. Though she wasn't always right, he told her it wasn't the season for rain. But then her eyes widened as a single snowflake drifted down. More followed until the air was filled with quiet flakes, and the two of them sat together beneath the first snow of the season. Ed admitted that with everything going on, he hadn't managed to gather enough firewood. He smiled faintly and said he didn't think he could do it alone, asking if she would help. After all, she had been the one to remind him. Lucy rushed at him and hugged him so hard it knocked him over. She asked if he really meant it, her voice bright with relief. Ed groaned from the impact, but told her he had grown used to life at the camp and had even planned improvements. It would probably be better if he stayed. Lucy threw herself at him again with another hug, leaving Ed flat on the ground with a sigh. And so, Act 2 came to an end. Ahead lay Act 3. The battle for the Student Council presidency between the Princess and Lortel would soon begin. More main characters and enemies would arrive at the Academy, and the final boss would appear, Lucy Mayriel. Ed knew there would be hardships, but he didn't want to think about them now. He had seen a side of Lucy that none of his playthroughs had ever revealed. A Lucy smiling at him, truly happy. Because of that, he believed they would be fine. Winter arrived, and heavy snow blanketed the camp. It meant more work for Ed, but he promised himself he wouldn't overdo it. He only needed to stay on top of his chores before beginning his duties as a scholarship student the next day. Since he had turned down the offer to move into Dex Hall, the Academy had rewarded him with a tuition scholarship, lifting his financial burden. He stepped out of the cabin quietly, Lucy still sleeping on his bed. He no longer bothered to throw her out. With her defensive magic, the cold wouldn't harm her, but now it felt wrong to force her away. The camp was silent, the academy quiet. No major events loomed on the horizon. Holding the golden phoenix ring in his hand, Ed thought this was the perfect time to take a risk. Clenching his fist, he activated it. Magic erupted from him in a surge of light. And he called out to Marilda.